My name is Jack Morrison, and I'm 43 years old. This happened in the fall of last year along Highway 160 near Durango, Colorado. A trip meant to heal old wounds and reconnect my family, which instead became a descent into a nightmare I can hardly recount without shudders. My wife, Sarah, had planned the vacation months in advance. After a string of personal setbacks that left me questioning my decisions and priorities, I reluctantly agreed that an RV camping trip might be just the reset we needed. With our 2 kids, Emily, 16, rebellious yet fiercely inquisitive, and Tommy, a sensitive 10-year-old whose quiet observations often revealed more than words, I loaded our aging RV and set out for what we thought would be a scenic escape into nature. The RV itself was a relic, a clunker that had seen better days. It coughed and wheezed along the narrow, winding roads of Colorado's backcountry, and as we drove, I couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. The mechanical glitches were just the start of our troubles, as if the vehicle itself were warning us that this journey was not going to be smooth. The forecast had promised unpredictable weather, and it wasn't long before rain began to lash against the windshield, reducing our vision to blurry streaks of gray. We eventually arrived at our destination, Whispering Pines Campground. The name, though poetic, held an unsettling reputation among locals, a place whispered about in hushed tones at isolated gas stations and small-town diners. It was said that the woods surrounding the campground were haunted by a spirit, a pale, sorrowful figure in a flowing white dress, cursed by a dark past tied to a cannibal cult of indigenous origin. I dismissed it at first as mere folklore, but as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, I couldn't help but feel that the legends might be more than just stories. The first night was eerily quiet. Sarah tried to set up our meager campsite while I tinkered with the RV's stubborn engine. Emily, ever the tech-savvy teenager, busied herself recording the fading light on her phone, determined to capture every moment. Tommy, however, remained silent, his wide eyes fixed on the deepening shadows of the pine forest. As I worked, I heard a soft whispering that seemed to drift on the wind, a barely audible murmur that brushed past my ear. I paused, tools in hand, straining to catch the words, but the sound melted into the rustle of the trees. Dinner that night was a tense affair. Over the clatter of utensils and the distant howl of the wind, Sarah confided that she'd spoken to a local at a nearby gas station earlier in the day. He'd warned us about the curse of Whispering Pines, describing an ancient tragedy involving a woman whose spirit was doomed to wander the woods after falling victim to a brutal cult. I could see the unease in Sarah's eyes as she recounted the details, and though I tried to remain pragmatic, a chill crept along my spine. The next morning, the weather had worsened. The RV's engine sputtered as we attempted to leave the campground, and it took all my efforts and a fair share of cursing to coax it back to life. The isolation became even more palpable when I realized that our cell phone reception had nearly vanished in the dense forest. We were on our own. As the day wore on, tensions began to rise. Sarah grew increasingly anxious, her intuition telling her that we should cut our trip short. I, on the other hand, was determined to press on, partly out of stubborn pride and partly because I needed to prove to myself that I could protect my family. Emily's insistence on documenting every strange occurrence only amplified the tension. She seemed to relish the idea of capturing something paranormal on camera, while Tommy's quiet dread was becoming impossible to ignore. He kept pointing at the darkening forest, whispering about the lady in white, even when none of us saw her. That evening, as twilight bled into night, I decided to take a short walk away from the RV to inspect some of the strange markings I'd noticed on a nearby tree. The carvings were crude yet deliberate, symbols that resembled ancient indigenous markings, perhaps tied to rituals long forgotten. My skin crawled as I traced my fingers over the rough bark. Suddenly, I heard a low, mournful moan echo through the pines, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or any animal I recognized. It was almost human, filled with despair and a hint of anger. I rushed back to the RV, heart pounding, and found Sarah standing in the doorway, her eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, unable to find words as the moaning grew louder, interspersed with a series of rapid, almost frantic whispers. Emily was already filming, her camera aimed toward the dark forest, capturing every detail. Tommy, clutching his favorite stuffed bear, whispered that he saw a pale figure moving between the trees. Sleep eluded us that night. I sat by the RV's small window, listening to the disembodied whispers and the occasional scraping sound, as if something, or someone, was trying to claw its way through the wood. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the legends were not merely local tales, but warnings of something truly dangerous. Over the next few days, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The RV's unreliable engine forced us to camp longer than planned, and the biting cold seeped into our bones. Group tensions reached a boiling point one morning when Sarah insisted we leave immediately, citing too many omens and strange occurrences. I countered, determined to stick to our itinerary and not be ruled by superstition. Emily sided with me, her curiosity piqued by the mysterious happenings, while Tommy's silent, fearful glances spoke volumes. The argument left a bitter residue in the cramped space of our RV, and I began to worry that our family unity was fracturing under the strain. One particularly stormy night, the supernatural presence made itself known in full force. A violent gust of wind rattled the RV, throwing open the door and scattering our belongings. I bolted out to secure the perimeter, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. In the flickering beam, I saw her, the spectral woman in white. She stood motionless among the trees, her eyes empty, yet filled with a sorrow so profound it nearly broke my heart. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as I stared into her ghostly gaze. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished, leaving only the sound of the howling wind in her wake. The next morning, we discovered more evidence that our ordeal was far from over. Carvings similar to those on the trees had appeared on the side of the RV, deep and deliberate, as if etched by an unseen hand. The dog, our neighbor's pet that we had taken in during an earlier stop, began to growl at the empty air. Its hackles raised in a silent warning. Sarah was convinced that these were signs of the curse coming to fruition, while I tried desperately to rationalize them away. Yet, deep down, I feared that we had awakened something ancient and malevolent. Determined to understand what we were facing, Sarah and Emily took to researching local legends at a nearby library in Durango. They uncovered accounts of a vengeful spirit, a woman wronged and sacrificed by a cannibal cult of indigenous origin, whose curse had haunted these woods for generations. According to local lore, her spirit was bound to the land, seeking revenge on those who dared disturb her resting place. The more we learned, the more I realized that the supernatural presence was not a passive haunting. It was dangerous, violent, and unpredictable. That night, the tension in the RV was unbearable. The storm outside intensified, and every creak of the old vehicle seemed to echo with impending doom. As I tried to catch a few moments of sleep, I heard Tommy's quiet whimper from the adjacent room. Rushing to his side, I found him huddled beneath a blanket, his eyes wide with terror. "Daddy, she's here," he whispered, barely audible over the howling wind. "I saw her. The lady in white. She's not nice." My heart pounded as I comforted him. all the while wondering if I should wake Sarah and Emily. But before I could decide, a violent crash echoed from the main area. I bolted out into the dim corridor of the RV to find that a heavy object had been thrown through the window, shattering the glass and spraying shards across the floor. In the midst of the chaos, I caught a glimpse of a figure, a dark, shifting silhouette that darted away into the storm. It was clear now. The spirit, or perhaps the force behind it, was not merely a passive observer. It was active, angry, and intent on making its presence known in violent ways. I gathered the children and Sarah, urging us to barricade the doors and windows. The RV, already vulnerable and creaking under the storm's assault, felt like a fragile fortress against an enemy we could neither see nor fight in conventional ways. In the ensuing hours, the supernatural assaults escalated. Unseen forces hurled objects across the cabin. Sarah's soft, anguished screams mingled with the crashing thunder outside. Emily's camera, left unattended on the table, recorded sporadic flashes of movement in the corners of the frame. A shadow that moved against the natural flow of light, as if defying the laws of physics. Each new incident deepened our sense of isolation and dread. At one point, amidst the chaos, I realized that the true horror was not just the ghostly woman but the deep-rooted curse that had awakened centuries ago. The carvings, the sudden gusts of cold wind, the inexplicable whispers, they were all part of a ritual, an ancient and malevolent force that had been dormant, waiting for an opportunity to exact its revenge. The legends spoke of death as an inevitable consequence of disturbing the sacred grounds of the curse, and I feared that we were now ensnared in a web from which there might be no escape. Then came the most harrowing moment of all. In the dead of night, as the storm subsided into a haunting stillness, Tommy slipped out of his sleeping bag. I awoke to find him missing from his bed. Panic surged through me as I scrambled out into the corridor, my voice echoing as I called his name. In the dim light cast by a flickering overhead lamp, I caught sight of a small, pale hand reaching out from under the RV's door. I dashed towards it, only to have an invisible force rip me back with a surge of icy wind. The confrontation reached its climax when I finally found Tommy outside, standing alone on a patch of rain-soaked ground near the edge of the woods. Before me, the spectral woman in white loomed once again, her form more defined and terrifying than ever. This time, her eyes burned with an intensity that was both sorrowful and vengeful. She moved towards Tommy with an otherworldly grace, and in that moment, I knew that if I did not act, my son would be lost forever to this malevolent force. Desperation lent me strength. I lunged forward, trying to shield Tommy, and shouted with all the might I could muster. The spirit recoiled, her form wavering as if caught in an invisible current. For a long, agonizing moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. I could feel the icy grip of death itself, and the echoes of ancient curses filled the air. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the assault ceased. The spirit faded into the darkness, leaving behind only the sound of my ragged breathing and the terrified sobs of my children. In the aftermath of that night, as dawn broke and revealed a landscape scarred by the storm, we gathered what little strength we had left. The RV, battered and broken, seemed like a coffin for our shattered hopes. Sarah and I exchanged looks of profound sorrow and determination. We had come too far, and our family had too much to lose, to simply abandon our lives to this curse. We made the decision then to seek help. I managed to contact a local historian who specialized in the lore of the area. He explained that the ghost was indeed linked to a tragic chapter in local history, a time when a cult, steeped in cannibalistic rituals and indigenous mysticism, had taken a dark turn. The woman in white was believed to be one of the cult's victims, her soul trapped in perpetual torment. lashing out at any who disturbed her resting place. Though his words did little to ease my fear, they gave me a glimmer of understanding and a possible path to appease the vengeful spirit. Armed with this knowledge, we returned to Whispering Pines campground one last time. With the historian's cryptic instructions, Sarah and I attempted a rudimentary ritual, a plea for forgiveness, and a request for peace from the restless spirit. Emily documented every step, her earlier fascination now tempered by a deep, reverent fear of the forces we were dealing with. Tommy, still traumatized by the near loss of his life, clutched my hand tightly as if our connection could anchor him to reality. That final night was fraught with tension and prayer. We lit a small fire, arranged the ancient symbols in a rough circle, and recited the historian's incantations. The wind died down to a whisper, and for a few fleeting minutes it felt as though the spirit was listening. Then, in a final act of eerie resignation, the figure of the woman in white appeared one last time. This time, her expression was not one of anger, but of profound sorrow. A silent farewell that suggested her tormented soul was finally being released. As the first rays of dawn broke over the pines, the spirit dissolved into the morning mist, leaving us alone with the scars of the past and the weight of our own survival. We packed our battered RV and left Whispering Pines behind, the echoes of its curse a permanent reminder of the night when the boundaries between our world and the supernatural had been irrevocably blurred. In the weeks that followed, our lives slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the memory of that cursed trip lingered like a shadow at the edge of every conversation. I found myself haunted by dreams of cold winds and sorrowful eyes, and even now, I hesitate whenever I hear the rustle of pines in a quiet night. Yet, through the ordeal, we emerged as a family bound not just by blood, but by the shared experience of facing something beyond human comprehension, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of ancient, unyielding evil. I still wonder about the nature of that curse. Was it merely a manifestation of the collective sorrow and rage of a people long forgotten, or was it the deliberate act of a vengeful force determined to exact retribution? Perhaps the truth lies buried beneath layers of myth and history, a secret whispered only by the wind in the dark woods of Colorado. All I know is that on that fateful journey along Highway 160, survival was not just about fighting a tangible enemy, but about confronting the deepest fears within ourselves. My name is Jack Morrison, and I survived that night, but I carry with me the burden of loss and the reminder that some curses, no matter how deeply hidden, are never truly laid to rest. My name is Michael Anderson, and I'm 37 years old. This all happened last summer when I decided to leave behind the suffocating routines of my old corporate life and the weight of my past mistakes. I purchased an aging RV and set out for Colorado National Monument, hoping that the vast, surreal landscapes and the isolation of the desert would help me heal. I remember the day I left like it was yesterday. The hot glare of the sun on the highway, the hum of the RV's engine that was as unreliable as my own hopes. My RV, a battered relic I affectionately called Old Faithful, had a mind of its own. It sputtered and coughed along the desert roads, each mechanical hiccup a metaphor for the instability I felt inside. But I pressed on, determined to face whatever lay ahead. The open roads of Colorado National Monument stretched out before me like a canvas painted with jagged red rock formations and swirling clouds of dust. At first, the journey was liberating. I'd parked on a lonely overlook, sat outside with a thermos of coffee, and marveled at the horizon. But as the day wore on, subtle signs began to creep into my periphery. Small, inexplicable occurrences that hinted I was not entirely alone. It started with my reflection. One afternoon, while driving along a deserted stretch of road, I glanced into the side mirror. For a split second, I saw something that wasn't me. A dark, shifting silhouette mimicking my every move, but with an unsettling delay. I chalked it up to a trick of the light, maybe even a result of the endless miles and my overactive imagination. But later that day, as I pulled over near a shallow puddle beside the road, I caught another glimpse. My reflection lingered a moment too long, its eyes dark and unfocused, as if beckoning me to look deeper into my own soul. That night, I camped near a rocky outcrop that jutted out against the twilight sky. The RV's interior was dimly lit by a single, flickering lamp, and the silence of the desert pressed against the thin walls. I sat on the worn couch, trying to lose myself in the pages of an old journal, when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to drift in through the vents. At first, I told myself it was the wind weaving its way through the crevices of the RV, but the sound persisted, a faint murmur that grew into a chorus of hushed voices when I closed my eyes. I tried to shake off the creeping unease the next morning. My plan was to explore a bit of the monument's rugged terrain on foot. I set out with only a small backpack, the arid landscape stretching out in every direction. It was during one of these solitary walks that I encountered a reclusive local in a tiny, weather-beaten town on the outskirts of the park. In the dim light of a dusty general store, he spoke in hushed tones about the legend of the Shadow Man. According to him, there was an old indigenous lore, a tale passed down through generations, about a mirror spirit that preyed on lost souls burdened by guilt and regret. He described the entity as a doppelganger, a dark reflection of a person that emerged when their inner demons were too overwhelming to bear. I listened, skeptical yet strangely captivated. I had always believed that my inner struggles were mine alone, but here was a legend that seemed to mirror my own hidden pain. Returning to the RV, the sense of isolation grew heavier. At first, it was just an odd sensation, like I was being watched from the corners of my vision. I began noticing that my personal items, my notebook, a cherished old watch, were not always where I left them. One morning, I awoke to find my notebook on the floor instead of its usual spot on the shelf. I'd swear I had left it on the desk the night before. My heart began to race as I considered the possibility that something was deliberately rearranging my life, echoing the disarray I felt internally. Then came the more overt encounters. I would catch a glimpse of movement in the reflections of the RV's windows, a shadow that mimicked my posture but with a subtle difference. Sometimes it appeared in the dashboard's reflection, standing silently behind me, even though I was alone. At other times I'd hear a sound, a soft scraping on the exterior of the RV like claws against metal, only to find nothing when I stepped outside. Each time, the sensation was as if I were being haunted by a part of myself that I had long tried to bury. The true test of my resolve came on a violent afternoon when a desert storm rolled in. The sky turned an angry shade of black, and the wind howled like a pack of wild beasts. I secured the RV as best as I could, watching the rain whip against the metal roof in chaotic torrents. It was in the midst of this tempest that the doppelganger made its presence undeniable. I was in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly, when I saw it clearly, a dark, shifting figure that looked exactly like me. It stood outside, illuminated by flashes of lightning, its form distorted and menacing. For a moment, I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. The shock of the sight was like a jolt of electricity that made my heart pound furiously. As the storm intensified, the doppelganger began to attack with a fury that mirrored the tempest. It wasn't a slow, creeping terror anymore. It was a violent, almost physical force. Objects in the RV flew through the air as if caught in a violent explosion. I ducked behind the counter, my mind racing with disbelief and fear. The entity was not content to merely haunt me. It seemed determined to dismantle everything I had built, both the tangible world of the RV and the fragile inner world I had been struggling to maintain. During a brief lull in the storm, I crept out of my hiding place to assess the damage. The RV's interior was in shambles, scratched walls, shattered glass, and scattered belongings that told a story of frantic violence. The most chilling evidence, however, was etched across the side of the RV. Deep, deliberate scratches that formed strange, almost ritualistic symbols. I stared at them, the implications sinking in. The local lore about the Shadow Man was no mere myth. It was something that had become real, a supernatural manifestation born of my own buried sorrows. In the following hours, as the storm began to subside, I realized that I couldn't keep running from this nightmare. My inner demons had taken on a tangible form, and the doppelganger was as dangerous as it was symbolic. My mind raced with memories of past failures, of moments when I'd felt inadequate and lost. I had spent so many years fleeing from those feelings, hiding behind the facade of a successful professional, that I'd forgotten what it meant to truly confront my own darkness. I made a decision. I drove Old Faithful toward a desolate, rocky outcrop that local legends said was the birthplace of the Shadow Man. The journey was agonizingly slow. The RV struggled on the uneven roads, and my thoughts churned with a mixture of dread and grim determination. I needed to face this creature not just to survive, but to reclaim a part of myself I had long abandoned. At the outcrop, the landscape was harsh and unyielding, with jagged rocks piercing the twilight. I parked the RV and stepped out into the cold, howling wind. The air was thick with tension, and every instinct in my body screamed that something monumental was about to happen. I could feel the weight of my guilt and regret pressing down on me, as if the land itself were absorbing my sorrows. There, under the ominous glare of a stormy sky, I saw it again. The doppelganger. It emerged slowly from the shifting shadows, every inch a mirror image of me, yet radiating a malevolence that chilled me to the core. Its eyes, dark and unyielding, met mine, and in that moment, I felt as though I were staring into the abyss of my own soul. We circled each other slowly, two versions of the same person locked in a silent battle of wills. The entity moved with a predatory grace, its every gesture a dark parody of my own. I remembered the local lore, the idea that the Shadow Man was born from the weight of unconfessed guilt, a being that existed only because I had refused to confront my past. The realization was as painful as it was liberating. As the wind howled around us, I stepped forward. I didn't know if my actions were driven by desperation or a newfound resolve to accept the truths I'd long denied. "I know you," I said, my voice trembling yet resolute. "I'm tired of running. It's time to face everything I've been hiding from." For a long, agonizing moment, the doppelganger merely watched me, its expression inscrutable. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, it lunged at me. The attack was fierce, a blur of dark limbs and furious energy. I dodged and countered, the clash of our struggle punctuated by the relentless roar of the wind and the staccato beat of my heart. Every blow I delivered felt like a desperate attempt to reclaim the parts of myself that had been lost to shame and regret. In that brutal dance of shadows, I realized that the battle was not one of physical strength alone, but of inner acceptance. With each clash, I felt the grip of my past loosening, the weight of years of self-doubt and unspoken pain beginning to lift. The doppelganger's attacks grew more frantic as if it sensed my resolve. It was a manifestation of every mistake, every moment of weakness, a force determined to keep me chained to a life of regret. The confrontation reached its peak as lightning illuminated the desolate outcrop, casting our twisted silhouettes against the jagged rocks. In a final, desperate bid for liberation, I steadied myself and shouted, "I forgive myself for all that I have done." The words, raw and unfiltered, reverberated through the storm. For an instant, time seemed to stand still. The doppelganger faltered, its dark form wavering in the brilliant flash of lightning, and then it began to dissolve like smoke caught in a sudden gust. I stood there, panting and bleeding, the remnants of the violent struggle scattered around me. The storm gradually subsided, and as the rain eased into a gentle drizzle, I saw that my enemy was fading away, leaving behind only a deep, resonant silence. I wasn't sure if I had truly defeated the doppelganger, or if I'd merely forced it into a temporary retreat. But in that moment, I felt a shift within myself. A quiet acceptance of my own flaws and the painful memories that had haunted me for so long. I made my way back to Old Faithful, the battered RV that had borne me through this harrowing journey. The ride back was slow and contemplative. I replayed every moment in my mind. The subtle reflections in the mirror, the eerie whispers, the violent storm, and the final showdown at the rocky outcrop. Each memory was a reminder that the real battle had never been against a supernatural enemy, but against the darkness within me. Now, as I write these words from a quiet, modest motel room in a small town near the monument, I know that my journey is far from over. The experience has left me with more questions than answers. Was the doppelganger simply a hallucination born of isolation and guilt, or was it something more? An ancient force that preys on the vulnerable, waiting to claim another lost soul. I can't say for sure, but what I do know is that I've been forced to confront the parts of myself I'd long tried to ignore. I still see flashes of that dark figure in the mirror from time to time, subtle reminders that the line between reality and the supernatural can blur when you're alone with your thoughts. Sometimes, when the desert wind howls outside my window, I feel the faintest whisper of that same voice, as if it's trying to tell me something I have yet to understand. In the quiet hours of the night, as I lie awake and listen to the distant rustle of the pines, I am reminded of the lesson I learned on that rocky outcrop. To confront one's inner demons is to embrace both the darkness and the light that dwell within. And while I may never fully banish the memory of that encounter, I have taken the first steps toward accepting my past, flaws, and all. This journey into the heart of the desert taught me that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are not those that lurk in the shadows of an ancient legend, but the ones that reside in the corners of our own minds. And as I continue to drive along the endless roads of Colorado, I do so with the hope that each mile brings me closer to understanding who I truly am. My name is Michael Anderson, and while I still battle the echoes of that dark reflection, I have learned that true freedom comes from facing the shadows within, and in doing so finding the strength to move forward, even when the road ahead is shrouded in uncertainty. My name is Jenna Roberts, and I am 29 years old. This happened last October in St. Elmo, Colorado, a ghost town steeped in lost history and haunted secrets. I'd been planning this RV camping trip for months, driven by an obsession with local legends and an insatiable curiosity about the past. I convinced my two best friends, Mark and Ryan, to join me on a weekend expedition to explore the eerie remains of what once was a bustling mining community, now reduced to decaying structures and whispered lore. We left Denver on a crisp autumn morning, the sky a clear expanse of blue as we cruised along winding mountain roads. Our RV, an old but serviceable rig I'd painstakingly renovated, rumbled along steadily until, just as we neared the outskirts of St. Elmo, the engine began to sputter. Ryan, ever the pragmatic problem solver, pulled over near a stretch of abandoned railroad tracks. "It's just a hiccup," he assured us, though his brow was furrowed with concern. I could already sense the tension creeping into the air, a subtle reminder that our journey might not go as smoothly as we'd hoped. Mark, whose imagination often veered into the realm of the supernatural, eyed the darkening mountains with apprehension. "I'm telling you," he whispered, "there's something off about this place." His voice, usually laced with exaggeration, held an edge of genuine fear that made me shiver despite the fading warmth of the day. After a short while, Ryan managed to coax the engine back to life. We resumed our journey, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. By late afternoon, we reached the outskirts of St. Elmo. The town was cloaked in an autumnal pallor, crumbling buildings, rusted mining equipment, and a stillness that was more oppressive than peaceful. We set up camp in what had once been the town's communal area, right next to an old mining structure that now served as a grim monument to forgotten tragedies. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly, an unseasonal chill that crept into our bones and forced us to huddle around a makeshift fire. I unpacked my bag of local lore and historical records, determined to piece together the story behind the ghost they called the Lady in White. The first signs of eeriness came not with a bang, but with subtle, unnerving details. As night fell, the RV's interior lights flickered intermittently, and the temperature dropped even further. At first, I blamed the faulty wiring or the failing battery, but then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic knocking on the walls of our RV. The sound was almost human, as if someone were tapping gently, waiting for us to answer. Mark was the first to break the silence. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryan shrugged, trying to maintain his skeptical calm, but even he couldn't hide a trace of uncertainty. I listened intently, trying to decipher the pattern of knocks, but they stopped as abruptly as they'd begun. Later that night, as we sat around the fire trying to reclaim some warmth and normalcy, I discovered something that made my heart pound. A small, vintage locket, half buried in the dirt near the edge of our campsite. Its surface was tarnished with age, and an inscription, nearly worn away, hinted at a tragic story. In memory of Eliza, lost but not forgotten. I felt a chill run down my spine as I clutched the locket, wondering if it belonged to the ghost of the murdered woman the locals referred to as the Lady in White. Sleep, if it could be called that, was a distant memory. I awoke several times during the night to find Mark staring out of the window, eyes wide with dread, and Ryan methodically checking the RV's perimeter. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the darkness outside seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. At dawn, the tension was palpable. Ryan managed to repair the RV's faulty heating system enough to keep us warm, but our communication devices remained stubbornly mute, as if the town itself had severed all ties to the outside world. Over a hurried breakfast, Mark recounted his dream from the previous night. A vivid vision of a pale woman in a flowing white dress, drifting among the trees and silently weeping. "She was right there, so close," he insisted, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I felt her pain." I tried to steady my voice, reminding him and myself that dreams were often just the mind's way of processing fear. Still, deep down, I couldn't dismiss the growing evidence that our surroundings were anything but ordinary. Determined to learn more, I suggested we explore the nearby remnants of the town. Despite the lingering chill and Mark's reluctance, we agreed. We piled into the RV, its engine now purring reliably after Ryan's early morning tinkering, and set out on foot toward the old mining district. The town itself was a haunting mosaic of decaying structures and ghostly echoes of the past. Every step we took seemed to stir up memories of a forgotten era, a time of desperate dreams and bitter tragedies. We found old mining equipment rusted by time, and walls covered in graffiti that spoke of loss and vengeance. Amidst the ruins, I came across a small, crumbling cemetery, its headstones tilted precariously, as if refusing to settle into the earth. It was here, among the tombstones, that we encountered the first overt sign of the supernatural. As we approached a particularly weathered marker, a sudden gust of wind sent leaves swirling in chaotic patterns. In that moment, a figure appeared. A spectral woman in a tattered white dress, her eyes full of sorrow and longing. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Mark gasped, and Ryan instinctively reached for a tool from his pack. The figure lingered for only a few agonizing seconds before dissolving into the mist, leaving behind a silence that was more deafening than any sound. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unease. We returned to the RV, but the encounter at the cemetery left us rattled. Mark's superstitions, once a source of humor in our group, now loomed large as an ominous certainty. Ryan, though still the voice of reason, began to show signs of apprehension. I found myself caught between their conflicting worldviews, trying to balance my own scientific curiosity with the undeniable evidence that something supernatural was at play. That evening, as dusk settled over St. Elmo, the paranormal events escalated. The RV's interior lights flickered violently, and I could swear I saw the locket I had found earlier glinting on the dashboard, though I hadn't placed it there. A low, mournful hum filled the air, a sound that resonated with the wind and seemed to emanate from deep within the very walls of the RV. Mark's anxiety reached a fever pitch. "She's here," he whispered repeatedly, his eyes darting toward the door. "The lady in white. She's watching us." Ryan, trying to maintain control, suggested that it was probably a battery malfunction or a trick of the light, but I could see the fear etched into his face. In that moment, I knew we were caught in a collision of worlds, the rational and the supernatural, and there was no turning back. Determined to confront the mystery head-on, I delved into my pile of historical records. I learned that Eliza, the woman whose name was inscribed on the locket, had been a young bride whose life was cut short under mysterious circumstances. Locals whispered that she had been betrayed by someone she loved, her spirit doomed to wander the ruins of St. Elmo until justice was served or her sorrow was soothed. I shared my findings with Mark and Ryan, and though our reactions differed, we agreed that the only way to free ourselves from this relentless haunting was to help her find peace. That night, we prepared for a confrontation. The RV, now fortified as best as we could manage with old wood planks and duct tape, became our temporary sanctuary. I improvised a makeshift altar using the locket, some faded photographs I found in a dilapidated building, and a few items from my research that spoke of local rituals. Mark, guided by his intuition, recited what he believed were invocations to reach out to Eliza's spirit. Ryan, ever practical, set up a perimeter of makeshift defenses around our camp, using what limited tools we had at hand. As midnight approached, the temperature plummeted, and the wind picked up, carrying with it distant echoes of sorrow and anger. The RV shook as if caught in the grip of an unseen force. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. My heart pounded in my ears as I clutched the locket, its cool metal a constant reminder of the tragic soul we sought to help. Suddenly, a violent crash reverberated through the RV. The door burst open, and in that split second I saw her. Eliza, the lady in white, her form shimmering with a spectral glow. This time she wasn't a mere apparition lurking on the edge of our vision. She was here, in our space, her eyes blazing with a mix of sorrow and fury. Mark stepped forward, his voice trembling as he addressed her. "Eliza, we're here to help you. Tell us what you need." His words were met with an eerie silence, punctuated only by the howling wind. Ryan, gripping his tool like a lifeline, hovered near the door, ready to defend us if the situation took a turn for the worse. For several long minutes, we stood frozen as Eliza's form shifted and flickered. The room filled with a spectral chill, and I felt as though I were standing at the threshold between life and death. Then, in a voice that was both ethereal and heartbreaking, she spoke. A voice that resonated with decades of pain. "Justice must be done," she whispered, the words barely audible above the tempest outside. It was then that the true nature of her torment became clear. Eliza was not a malevolent spirit seeking to harm us for its own sake. She was a victim, trapped in an endless cycle of sorrow and anger. But her anguish had manifested in dangerous, unpredictable ways. The next moments were a blur of desperate gestures and frantic actions. The ghost's presence grew increasingly violent. Objects flew through the air, and the RV's walls groaned under the strain of unseen forces. In the chaos, Ryan's pragmatic approach gave way to sheer survival instinct. He managed to secure the door and barricade the windows, but even that provided only a temporary respite from the supernatural assault. Mark, fueled by a mix of fear and determination, continued his incantations, urging Eliza's spirit to find peace and release her grip on the living world. I, for my part, clutched the locket and repeated the words I had read from a faded manuscript, a plea for redemption and forgiveness. The power of our combined efforts, the mingling of ancient lore and desperate hope, created a fragile bridge between our world and hers. Slowly, the violent manifestations began to subside. The howling wind eased into a mournful sigh, and the spectral glow that enveloped Eliza dimmed to a soft, sorrowful luminescence. In that quiet aftermath, as the first hints of dawn broke over the dark horizon, Eliza's form wavered and then faded into the gentle light of day. The oppressive presence that had haunted our RV receded, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of melancholy and loss. We had faced a ghost that was dangerous and volatile, a spirit whose pain had almost cost us our lives, and somehow, through our combined efforts, we had offered her the solace she had been denied in death. The aftermath was bittersweet. Our RV, battered and scarred from the night's ordeal, limped its way back to a semblance of functionality as Ryan managed to jury-rig repairs. Mark, though visibly shaken, felt a strange relief, as if confronting the spectral terror had lifted an unbearable weight from his shoulders. I, too, was changed. The experience had etched itself into my soul, a haunting reminder of the fragile boundary between the past and the present, between justice and retribution. In the days that followed, we lingered in St. Elmo, unable to fully shake the memory of that night. We spent hours poring over local archives, determined to piece together every detail of Eliza's tragic story. The local community, though wary of outsiders, eventually shared their own recollections, a patchwork of legends and first-hand accounts that painted a picture of a young woman betrayed by love and abandoned by a society too quick to forget. It was a tale of injustice and sorrow, a legacy of pain that had bound her spirit to the ruins of her former life. One afternoon, as we sat outside our RV on a rocky outcrop overlooking the ghost town, Ryan broke the silence. "I never believed in all this supernatural stuff," he said quietly, "but last night, I saw something I can't explain. It wasn't evil for the sake of evil, it was anger, sorrow, a need to be heard." Mark nodded solemnly, and I could see in his eyes that the terror he'd felt had given way to a deep, abiding empathy for the lost soul we'd encountered. Our time in St. Elmo eventually came to an end. With the RV finally repaired enough to carry us home, we left the ghost town behind, each of us carrying our own private scars from that night. I kept the locket as a reminder, a symbol of Eliza's enduring sorrow and a testament to the fragile line between myth and reality. And though the haunting had ceased, the memory of the lady in white lingered like a soft, persistent echo, a reminder that some wounds of the past never truly heal. Looking back now, I realize that our trip was never just about debunking legends or testing our own courage. It was about confronting the hidden histories that live in the forgotten corners of our world, and about acknowledging that sometimes the supernatural is nothing more than the unresolved anguish of those who came before us. In St. Elmo, we didn't just survive a ghost's wrath. We encountered a legacy of grief that demanded justice, compassion, and the willingness to listen. I often wonder what became of Eliza's spirit after that night. Perhaps, in some quiet corner of St. Elmo, her soul finally found a measure of peace. Or perhaps her story, like the ghost town itself, remains an eternal reminder of the cost of neglecting the voices of the past. For me, the experience has left an indelible mark, a bittersweet blend of horror and hope. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, there lies the possibility of redemption and understanding. As I drive through the Colorado backcountry today, the memory of that eerie weekend remains vivid. The winds still carry whispers of lost souls, and the fading light of dusk sometimes reveals a fleeting glimpse of a white dress in the distance. And though I sometimes feel that familiar chill, I know that I have done my part to honor a life lost too soon. And in doing so, I have come to understand that even the most terrifying apparitions may be nothing more than a cry for help, a call that we, in our humanity, must not ignore. My name is Marcus Caldwell, and I am 42 years old. This happened last November in the San Juan National Forest near Telluride, Colorado, a time when the forest wears autumn like a mourning cloak, and every gust of wind seems to whisper secrets of lost time. I embarked on this solitary RV trip to escape a past that had long haunted me, a past riddled with guilt, regret, and memories I could neither forget nor forgive. I hoped that by isolating myself among towering pines and the reflective stillness of mountain lakes, I might finally confront the demons lurking inside my own mind. I set off early on a chilly morning, leaving behind the relentless noise of the city and its reminders of my personal tragedy. My RV, a weathered but steadfast companion that had seen better days, chugged along the winding roads. Despite its age, I trusted it implicitly, perhaps as much as I trusted myself to survive what lay ahead. Yet, as I navigated a narrow mountain pass, the RV began to shudder and stall unexpectedly. The engine coughed, and I was forced to pull over to the shoulder, frustration mingling with an uneasy premonition. I checked the gauges and fiddled with the ignition, feeling that each moment of uncertainty was a portent of the inexplicable events to come. After some careful adjustments, and a few choice words at the dashboard, I managed to coax the engine back to life. I continued my journey, but the unsettling feeling had already begun to seep into my bones. As dusk fell, I reached a secluded clearing by a pristine mountain lake. The water lay undisturbed, its surface mirroring the bruised sky and the gnarled silhouettes of ancient trees. I decided this was the perfect spot to set up camp, believing that solitude in nature would bring me the peace I so desperately sought. That first night, as I prepared a modest meal on a portable stove and sipped lukewarm coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not entirely alone. The silence around me was profound, a vast emptiness punctuated only by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a lone owl. I had expected solitude, but not this pervasive sense of being watched. I shrugged it off as mere nerves and the lingering echo of my troubled thoughts. Lying in bed that night, I found sleep elusive. I kept glancing at the small mirror on my bedside table and, for a fleeting moment, thought I saw a figure. Someone who looked uncannily like me, in the reflective surface. I blinked hard, dismissing it as a trick of my weary mind. But the image lingered, unsettling in its precision. I convinced myself it was nothing more than a half-awake hallucination, a byproduct of stress and solitude. In the early hours before dawn, I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. I remembered the glimpse in the mirror, and then I noticed something even stranger. As I sipped water at the RV's sink, the window behind me caught a movement, a shadow that drifted silently across the walls, mimicking my own posture. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing but the empty darkness outside. A chill crept up my spine as I wondered if my own mind was beginning to betray me. The following day, determined to shake off the previous night's disquiet, I ventured out to explore the area. I walked along a narrow trail that skirted the edge of the lake, my boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth. The forest was beautiful, yet eerie, every tree standing like a silent witness to the secrets of the past. As I wandered deeper, I noticed a series of fresh footprints along the muddy path. Footprints that unmistakably mirrored my own. I paused, crouching to inspect them. They were too precise, too identical. It was as if someone, or something, had been following me. I felt my pulse quicken and a sense of dread settle over me. That evening, back at the RV, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling of having been shadowed. I set up camp and tried to distract myself with the radio, though static was the only response. I journaled my thoughts, trying to piece together rational explanations for the inexplicable events. But as the sky darkened and a dense fog rolled in from the lake, reality began to blur with the surreal. It was then that I began to see reflections that weren't my own. While checking my supplies one night, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the rearview mirror of the RV. A man whose eyes held a deep sorrow, his face a mirror image of my own. I froze, a chill of recognition and terror shooting through me. I waited, breath caught in my throat, but when I turned around, there was nothing there except the flickering light of a dying camp lantern. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a manifestation of my inner torment, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. Over the next few days, the phenomenon grew more insistent. I was alone now, the only occupant of the RV, and each morning I discovered that the strange occurrences from the previous night had left their mark. The lake's surface began to act as a perverse mirror, sometimes reflecting my solitary figure, and other times showing a shadow that moved independently of my actions. I would catch fleeting images of that spectral double standing on the water's edge, his gaze locked on me as if he were daring me to confront him. I began to document everything in my journal. Every unsettling moment, every inexplicable shadow, and every instance of that doppelganger's presence. My nights became a constant battle between sleep and wakefulness, the line between reality and hallucination growing ever thinner. The solitude I had once craved now felt suffocating, the silence of the forest amplifying my innermost fears. One particularly stormy night, as lightning tore the sky apart and rain hammered against the RV, I was jolted awake by a deafening crash. I bolted upright, heart racing, as I heard the unmistakable sound of the RV's door creaking open. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, its beam trembling in my grip as I shone it into the murky darkness beyond the door. There, standing in the threshold, was the doppelganger. It was as if my inner torment had taken on a corporeal form, a perfect, ghostly replica of myself, but with eyes that burned with a mixture of anguish and hostility. For a long, breathless moment, We simply stared at each other. The creature's presence exuded an aura of menace, and I felt as if I were looking into a mirror that reflected not just my face, but the darkest parts of my soul. Then, in a voice that was both my own and yet disturbingly alien, the figure spoke, "You cannot run from what you are." The words echoed in the confines of the RV, mingling with the roar of the storm outside. I stumbled backward, heart pounding so fiercely I thought it might burst from my chest. I realized then that this spectral double was not merely a figment of my imagination, but a manifestation of the guilt and grief I had long suppressed. It was as if my inner demons had taken shape, determined to haunt me until I faced the truth of my past. With the storm raging and the doppelganger advancing, I scrambled to fortify the RV. I pushed furniture against the door, bolted the windows, and even armed myself with a heavy wrench from the RV's small toolkit. Every instinct screamed at me to fight, yet another part of me recognized that this battle was not with an external force, but with the very essence of my own being. I retreated to a corner of the RV, heart still racing, and began to write furiously in my journal by the light of a flickering lantern. I poured out memories of the loss that had shattered my life, memories of a mistake I could never undo, of a promise broken and a soul lost. As I wrote, the storm outside seemed to mirror my internal turmoil, each flash of lightning illuminating pages filled with regret and sorrow. I realized that the doppelganger was forcing me to confront the very guilt I had been trying to escape. Then, in a moment of excruciating clarity, I understood what I had to do. I rose from my makeshift barricade and walked to the center of the RV, facing the darkness where I knew the spectral figure would appear. I began to speak, first softly, then with increasing conviction, as I recited my confession aloud. I admitted my mistakes, I acknowledged my grief, and I begged for forgiveness, from myself and from the memory of the one I had lost. The temperature in the RV seemed to drop further, and the shadows deepened around me. For several agonizing minutes, I continued my monologue, my voice steady even as my hands shook. And then, as if the very air had shifted, the doppelganger materialized once more. It stood across the room, its eyes locked on mine, its expression unreadable. The ensuing moments were a clash of wills. The doppelganger moved with a disconcerting grace, its actions both mirroring and challenging my own. At one point, it lunged toward me, as if trying to wrest the guilt from my heart. But I held my ground, repeating words of self-forgiveness and acceptance. The room filled with a palpable tension, the kind that exists only when one is caught between two forces, one external and one internal. Outside, the storm reached a fever pitch, and I could hear the wind battering against the RV as if it too were struggling against an unseen adversary. Inside, the confrontation between my haunted past and my desperate will to heal became a battle of light against darkness. I felt a surge of energy, a cathartic release of all the pain I had bottled up over the years, and I let it flow through me. I could almost see the doppelganger falter, its hostile expression softening into one of sorrowful resignation. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, declaring my truth to the spectral presence. Slowly, the figure began to fade, its edges dissolving into the swirling mists that had gathered within the RV. The storm outside began to abate, and as the first tentative rays of dawn broke through the clouds, I realized that I had, in some way, banished the haunting reflection of my inner torment. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with a strange mix of relief and lingering melancholy. I sank onto the floor, exhausted but strangely at peace. The journal lay open before me, its pages now a testament to a battle fought not with fists or force, but with vulnerability and acceptance. I knew that while the doppelganger might have vanished, the scars it left behind would remain as a reminder of the need to confront one's deepest wounds. In the days that followed, I worked on restoring a sense of normalcy to my isolated camp. The RV, though still showing signs of wear from the ordeal, slowly became a sanctuary of introspection rather than a prison of guilt. I spent long hours by the lake, watching my reflection ripple across the water. A reminder that while the past might haunt me, it did not define me entirely. I began to see the forest not as a labyrinth of shadows, but as a place of renewal, where even the most tormented souls could find a measure of solace. As I packed up my belongings to leave the forest, I took one last look at the reflective pool by the edge of the camp, a pool that, on quiet moments, seemed to offer a glimpse of another world. I carried with me the lessons of those stormy nights, that sometimes the most formidable battles are fought within, and that acceptance and forgiveness can be the keys to freeing oneself from an endless cycle of remorse. Driving away from the San Juan National Forest, I felt an unfamiliar lightness in my step. The road stretched out before me, a symbol of new beginnings and the promise of healing. I knew that the scars of my past would never fully disappear, but I had taken a decisive step toward making peace with them. In that moment, as I merged onto a sunlit highway and left the dark woods behind, I felt that I was not running away from my history, but rather embracing the possibility of a future unburdened by regret. Now, whenever I catch a glimpse of my reflection, whether in a window or the smooth surface of a lake, I see not the haunted, sorrowful man I once was, but someone who has faced his inner demons and emerged on the other side, forever changed, yet resolute. My journey in the San Juan National Forest was a confrontation with the spectral embodiment of my own guilt, a battle that was as terrifying as it was transformative. As I continued to drive through the backroads of Colorado, I am reminded of that stormy night when the shadows of my past took form, and of the strength I discovered in confronting them. My name is Marcus Caldwell, and I carry the memory of that time like a scar, visible yet healing, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, there is the potential for redemption and a new dawn. O Three Mini. My name is Tyler, I am 34, and this happened in the remote reaches of Gunnison National Forest, Colorado, a place so vast and silent that you quickly learn the language of isolation. I had planned this RV trip as a much-needed escape from the chaos of everyday life, a chance to breathe fresh mountain air and reconnect with nature. I never imagined that escape would become a harrowing battle for survival against something that should only exist in whispered legends. I set out early on a crisp October morning with my loyal dog by my side and a small ragtag group of friends and family who shared my yearning for solitude. Among them was Jenny, a free-spirited soul with a sensitive heart who often saw beyond the veil of the mundane. My older brother Mark, ever the stoic protector, and Ethan, a longtime friend with a rebellious streak who prided himself on dismissing superstitions as mere flights of fancy, completed our motley crew. We had rented an old RV, a relic whose engine coughed and spluttered more than it purred, and that's when the first hint of trouble began. While our destination was meant to be a rejuvenating retreat, the RV's malfunctioning heater and persistent mechanical issues foreshadowed the disarray to come. Our journey wound through narrow mountain roads, past rugged peaks and dense stands of pine, until we finally reached a secluded clearing near an ancient stand of trees deep in Gunnison National Forest. We set up camp in the late afternoon, the fading sunlight casting long, eerie shadows among the towering pines. As dusk approached, an unsettling hush fell over our little campsite. I was the first to notice it. A series of soft whispers carried on the wind, mingled with what unmistakably sounded like distant, childlike laughter. It was hollow and disembodied, as if echoes from a place long forgotten were attempting to communicate with us. Jenny was the one who noticed something even stranger the next morning. While exploring a narrow trail nearby, she stopped in her tracks, eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and fear. Carved into the trunk of a gnarled pine were symbols that resembled indigenous petroglyphs, intermingled with cryptic markings we had never seen before. They looked deliberately placed, as if someone, or something, had intended them as a warning. As night descended on our second day, the atmosphere grew thick with tension. The fire we built sputtered uncertainly in the chill wind, and our conversation was punctuated by anxious glances toward the tree line. I, ever the planner, tried to reassure everyone that it was merely the isolation playing tricks on our minds. But even I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness. That night, as the storm clouds gathered overhead and a torrential downpour began to lash the forest, our worst fears materialized. We huddled inside the RV, its rattling windows barely shielding us from the fury of the storm. It was then that I first saw it. A silhouette on the edge of the tree line, moving with a speed that defied human capability. At first, I chalked it up to the lightning's fleeting illumination, but soon the figure became unmistakable. It wasn't long before the unexplainable escalated into violence. I awoke in the early hours to the sound of the RV being violently shaken. Outside, amidst the crashing rain and howling wind, something was attacking our vehicle. I forced the door open, heart pounding, to see deep claw marks slashing across the metal exterior of the RV. The creature was there, a skinwalker, a shapeshifter drawn from the ancient legends of the Navajo people, reimagined in our remote Colorado backwoods. The skinwalker was no mere specter that lingered to spook us. It was a predatory force, violent and cunning. Its eyes gleamed with an otherworldly malice, and when it moved, it seemed to shift its form, mimicking familiar voices, even taking on the semblance of someone we'd lost long ago. Ethan, ever the skeptic, was the first to dismiss our terror as an overreaction. His cynicism evaporated, however, when he caught a glimpse of that shifting face in the corner of his eye, a face that morphed from something human into a snarling, inhuman visage. The encounter shattered the fragile peace that had held our group together. Mark, who had always relied on logic and practicality, found his skepticism crumbling as the creature's assault became more brazen. His protective instincts took over, and soon we were embroiled in heated debates over what to do next. Some argued we should abandon the RV and flee on foot, while others, like Jenny, insisted on trying to understand the lore behind these attacks. In the frantic hours that followed, we discovered old references to Native American legends, stories that spoke of a skinwalker capable of preying on isolation and fear. These tales mentioned that the creature could be repelled by certain traditional symbols and offerings, rituals meant to ward off evil. With no other choice, we decided to scramble through our limited supplies and search for anything that might serve as a makeshift ward. In the flickering light of our hastily arranged campsite, we gathered items from the surrounding forest. Bundles of sage, rough-hewn branches, and even some of the carvings that Jenny had photographed. With trembling hands, I tried to recall the fragments of lore I had researched before our trip. The skinwalker was not merely an ethereal presence. It was a living, breathing threat that attacked without warning, leaving behind deep, violent scars on our RV and on our hearts. The first fatality. As the night wore on, the storm's ferocity reached a fever pitch. The creature circled the RV relentlessly, its low growls mingling with the relentless pounding of rain. In a moment of desperate clarity, Mark and I decided to take a stand. We bolted the RV's door and began fortifying our position with any materials we could muster. It was during this frantic defense that tragedy struck. In a violent burst of movement, the skinwalker lunged at Mark. I remember the sound, a sickening, wet thud. As he was thrown against the side of the RV, his body crumpling under the force of the attack. The creature's claws dug deep into his flesh, leaving behind wounds that oozed with dark, viscous blood. I rushed to his side, my heart shattering as I realized that this was no longer a legend or a trick of the mind. It was deadly, and it had claimed one of us. Ethan's derisive laughter had long since faded into silent horror, and Jenny's eyes filled with tears as she cradled Mark's head in her lap. The weight of our situation pressed down on us like the storm itself, a crushing reminder that we were utterly alone in a forest that harbored ancient, malevolent forces. In the agonizing hours after Mark's death, we huddled together in the RV, shivering from both cold and terror. Jenny's intuition had proven true. Our surroundings held more secrets than we could have imagined. With Mark's dying words echoing in my mind, I resolved to find a way to fend off the creature, even if it meant confronting the very legends I had once dismissed. With trembling determination, I led the survivors, Jenny, Ethan, and our faithful dog, out into the tempest. We trekked through the rain-soaked forest in search of a clearing where we could perform the ritual described in the fragments of lore we had pieced together. Each step felt like a descent into madness, as the wind whispered disjointed voices, and the trees themselves seemed to lean in, as if listening to our every move. We reached a small clearing, the ground slick with mud and strewn with leaves. In the center, I set about arranging the makeshift symbols we had gathered. With my hands shaking, I recited the words I barely understood, a haphazard mix of ancient chants and desperate pleas. The forest around us fell eerily silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation. For a moment, it seemed as if our actions might have worked. The air thickened, and I thought I saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing, an almost hesitant pause in the creature's relentless pursuit. But our respite was short-lived. The skinwalker emerged again, more furious and determined than before. Its eyes burned with an unholy light, and it attacked with renewed savagery. The final confrontation was as chaotic as it was brutal. We retreated back to the RV, our meager barricade proving a fragile shield against a creature that thrived on fear. The skinwalker circled us, its presence an unrelenting reminder of the ancient evil we faced. In that final desperate night, every second stretched into an eternity of terror and heartache. Jenny, whose empathy and intuitive strength had guided us thus far, took up a position near the RV's door. Ethan, his earlier cynicism now replaced by raw, unfiltered terror, armed himself with a makeshift spear fashioned from a broken branch. I could see the determination etched on their faces, a silent pact to fight for our lives, even as the odds dwindled with each passing moment. The creature attacked again and again, its assaults marked by bursts of unnatural speed and ferocity. I remember the sound of its claws raking across the metal of the RV, the taste of fear mingling with the bitter tang of rain on my tongue. In one final desperate act, we launched a counterattack inspired by the indigenous lore we had uncovered. I hurled a bundle of sage and hastily scrawled symbols at the creature, my voice hoarse as I chanted the ancient incantations that I hoped would drive it back. For a terrifying moment, time seemed to stand still. The skinwalker hesitated, its eyes flickering with confusion and rage. Then, with a bone-chilling howl that cut through the storm, it surged forward one last time. In that maelstrom of chaos, Ethan sacrificed himself, throwing his body into the creature's path to give the rest of us a chance to escape. His scream, a mixture of defiance and despair, echoed in the storm as the skinwalker struck him down. I can still recall the sensation of the creature's claw connecting with Ethan's flesh, the sickening sound that accompanied his fall. In the aftermath, as the creature's rage subsided and it retreated into the dark recesses of the forest, we were left with a silence more deafening than the storm. The RV, now a battered shell of what once promised a safe haven, stood as a monument to our desperate struggle against an ancient evil. In the early light of dawn, the storm finally subsided, leaving behind a landscape that looked as if it had been ravaged by some supernatural force. With heavy hearts and aching limbs, Jenny and I gathered what little we could salvage. We made our way on foot toward a nearby ranger station, our minds numb with shock and sorrow over the losses we had suffered. Mark, our protective rock, and Ethan, whose sacrifice had bought us precious moments of reprieve. As we trudged through the muddy trails, every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves sent our nerves into overdrive. The forest, once a symbol of natural beauty and solitude, had transformed into a labyrinth of lurking nightmares. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the skinwalker to reappear from the shadows, its malevolent eyes watching my every move. At the ranger station, the staff listened in disbelief as I recounted the night's horrors. Their faces were etched with sympathy and concern, yet even they could not fully comprehend the ancient evil that had stalked us through the heart of Gunnison National Forest. I spent long, sleepless nights there, haunted by the memories of that final confrontation, by the screams, the fleeting glimpses of that shifting, demonic form, and the cold, unyielding terror that had gripped us all. In the weeks that followed, I found myself plagued by nightmares and intrusive memories. The forest, the screams, and the relentless attack of the skinwalker became a recurring specter in my dreams. Jenny tried to reach out with comfort and understanding, yet even her gentle reassurances could not erase the shadow that had been cast upon our souls. The loss of Mark and Ethan weighed heavily on me, a constant reminder that the cost of survival had been measured in blood and sacrifice. Now, as I sit by my window in a city far removed from those ancient pines, I still hear echoes of that cursed night. Every gust of wind carries with it a whisper, a ghostly, half-formed phrase that seems to beckon me back to that dark clearing in Gunnison National Forest. The legends of the skinwalker, once dismissed as superstition and folklore, have become my unending reality. I've spent countless hours poring over old texts and Native American lore, desperate to understand what we faced that night. The skinwalker, I learned, was not merely a shapeshifter but a manifestation of the forest's collective fear. A creature that thrived on isolation and despair, preying upon those who dared to venture into its realm alone. It was a violent force, one that left a trail of physical and psychological scars in its wake. Yet, even with all this knowledge, I cannot help but wonder if we truly banished it, or if it remains, lurking just beyond the edges of our safe spaces, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. Even as the years pass, the memory of that night refuses to fade. I still feel the weight of those lost lives, the echo of their final moments etched deep into my conscience. Every time I see a shadow shift in the corner of my eye or hear a faint, inexplicable whisper in the wind, I am transported back to that tempestuous night. The forest taught me that some legends are born from truth, that the boundary between the natural and the supernatural is perilously thin. My story is not one of triumph, but of survival, of a desperate fight against an ancient evil that defied all logic and reason. It is a tale of isolation, where the familiar became hostile, and the unknown took on a shape that was both terrifying and all too real. As I look back on those days, I am filled with a grim determination to warn others. The wilderness holds secrets that should never be disturbed. and some forces once awakened may never truly be laid to rest. I have returned to civilization, yet the forest calls to me in my dreams. Jenny, who remains a steadfast friend, and I occasionally meet to discuss what happened, always ending our conversations with a quiet nod to those who were lost. Mark, Ethan, and the countless souls whose fates have been intertwined with the dark legends of the backwoods. In the end, the experience left me with scars that run deeper than any physical wound. The night the Skinwalker came was a brutal reminder that nature is not always benign, and that some ancient evils lie dormant, waiting patiently in the shadows of our world. The forest, with its whispering pines and hidden clearings, remains a place of beauty and terror, a realm where every rustle of leaves could herald the return of the unspeakable. My name is Tyler. I am 34, and I carry these memories like a second skin. Each day, I strive to reconcile the rational part of me with the undeniable, terrifying reality of that night. And though I now live in a world that seems safe and predictable, I know that the darkness of Gunnison National Forest still lingers. A silent reminder that the line between myth and reality is all too fragile. This story, filled with the weight of loss, the raw intensity of supernatural terror, and the unyielding force of ancient legends, serves as a testament to the price of survival in a world where nature itself may harbor unfathomable evils. I write these words in the hope that others might heed the warnings woven into the fabric of our shared history, a history where the supernatural and the human are inextricably linked, and where every shadow might conceal a nightmare waiting to be unleashed. My name is Daniel. I am 40, and this happened in the shadowed valleys of Ouray, Colorado, nestled deep within the rugged peaks of the San Juan Mountains. I had driven my aging RV to a secluded mountain meadow, seeking refuge from a lifetime of regret and a grief that had haunted me ever since I lost my child. I believed that isolation in the wild might help me come to terms with my past, but I was unprepared for the ghosts that awaited me. I had been a solitary man for many years, and after the loss of my little girl, I found solace only in the silence of nature. My RV, a battered but reliable old vehicle, was my moving sanctuary. I traveled alone, leaving behind the clamor of everyday life, convinced that the crisp mountain air and the serene landscapes of Ouray could somehow mend the broken pieces of my heart. Arriving in the early afternoon, I parked the RV on a narrow, grassy clearing surrounded by dense, towering pines. The valley was draped in an early autumn mist, and the mountain peaks loomed in the distance like ancient sentinels guarding forgotten secrets. The RV's engine coughed and spluttered as I turned it off, and I couldn't help but feel that the machine's weariness mirrored my own tired soul. As I set up camp, I took a moment to absorb my surroundings. The quiet was almost too complete. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the soft wind and the distant call of a bird. It was in that quiet that I hoped to find a measure of peace. Yet, as night began to creep over the mountains, an unsettling feeling crept into my heart. The first unsettling sign came on my second evening. I was sitting outside the RV, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, when I noticed something unusual near the edge of the clearing. In the dim light, I saw a small, weathered toy, a tiny wooden car with chipped paint, lying on the damp ground. I knew I'd never brought anything like that with me, and my heart sank. It was reminiscent of the toys my daughter used to cherish, and for a moment I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine. That night, as the wind whispered through the pines, I began to hear the faint sound of giggles, soft, echoing laughter that seemed to drift on the breeze. It was not the innocent laughter of a child at play, but something else, something laden with sorrow and longing. I told myself that it was only the wind playing tricks on me, yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The next morning, determined to dismiss these eerie occurrences as mere coincidences born of my grief, I set out on a walk along a narrow trail that wound through the forest. The ground was slick with dew, and the mist clung to the trees like a ghostly shroud. As I walked, I found myself drawn to a particularly old pine tree with gnarled bark. Carved into its trunk were strange symbols, markings that looked part indigenous petroglyph, part something unrecognizable. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. The symbols seemed deliberate, as if left behind by someone who wished to warn or beckon. I took out my phone to photograph them, though the image felt more like a memory than evidence. Back at the RV, I tried to focus on repairs and mundane tasks to distract myself from the unsettling experiences. The RV's heater had started acting up again, and I spent hours tinkering with its faulty wiring. With each twist of a screwdriver, I felt the weight of my loneliness and the suffocating grief for my daughter. I had always believed that isolation might help dull the pain, but now it seemed to magnify every regret and every memory. In a small town not far from my campsite, I ventured into a dusty library to look up local history. I discovered old newspaper clippings and diaries detailing a tragic mining accident that had claimed the lives of several children many decades ago. The stories spoke of ghostly apparitions, sad, pale-faced figures of children roaming the woods, their laughter and cries echoing through the mountains. I felt a shiver of recognition. The events of that long-forgotten tragedy seemed to resonate with my own sense of loss. Could it be that these ghost children were not mere figments of my imagination, but echoes of a past tragedy reaching out across time? Shadows in the mist. That night, the atmosphere around the RV grew heavier, as if the very air was charged with sorrow. I sat by a small fire, the flames flickering against the encroaching darkness. The silence was soon broken by the sound of soft footsteps crunching on the gravel nearby. I looked up, and through the shifting mist I saw faint shapes, small, indistinct figures that appeared to be children. They moved slowly, their forms barely illuminated by the dying light. I called out, "Hello?" in a trembling voice, but the figures did not respond. Their faces were hidden in shadow, and I couldn't tell if they were merely watching or beckoning me closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to understand what I was witnessing. Had my grief conjured these visions, or was the forest unveiling a hidden sorrow that had long been buried? Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the RV and every gust of wind felt like a whisper from another realm, a reminder of loss and longing. I lay awake, haunted by the soft, persistent echo of laughter and crying that seeped in from the forest. In the dim light of dawn, I resolved that I must uncover the truth behind these apparitions, no matter how painful the journey might be. Determined to piece together the mystery, I gathered my meager supplies and made my way back to the small town I had visited before. There, in the library and through conversations with a few locals, I learned more about the tragic history of Ouray. The mining accident, it turned out, had left a deep scar on the community. The children who perished were never properly mourned, and over time, their restless spirits had become intertwined with the natural landscape. I met with an elderly local historian who spoke in hushed tones about the sorrow that lingered in the mountains. "They say the children never left," he murmured, his eyes distant with memories. "Their laughter is a lament for what was lost, and their cries, a plea for recognition." His words stirred something deep within me, a recognition of the unresolved grief that had defined my existence since the day I lost my daughter. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to my campsite with a renewed sense of purpose. I began to document every detail: the strange toy, the symbols on the tree, and the fleeting visions of ghostly children. Each piece of evidence seemed to weave a tapestry of loss and longing that was both ancient and achingly familiar. In the days that followed, the apparitions grew more frequent and more insistent. Late one night, as a dense fog rolled in, I was awoken by the sound of soft weeping just outside the RV. I crept to the door and peered out into the swirling mist. Among the shadows, I saw a figure that sent a jolt of recognition through me. A little girl, with eyes that held an inexplicable sorrow. The figure moved slowly, as if weighed down by an unbearable grief, and then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I tried to convince myself that these were mere tricks of a troubled mind, but the evidence was overwhelming. The RV, once a mobile refuge, now felt like a confining prison where the past and the present collided. Mechanical failures, the relentless weather, and the ever-present specters of lost children left me feeling isolated and vulnerable. I began to record my experiences in a journal, writing down every detail in a desperate bid to make sense of the inexplicable. As the ghostly encounters became part of my daily existence, I found myself conversing with the apparitions, as if they were remnants of a life I had long abandoned. In the quiet moments before dawn, I would whisper apologies and confessions to the empty air, hoping that some part of me might finally be forgiven. The turning point came on a particularly cold and foggy night. The RV's heater had failed entirely, leaving me shivering in the darkness. I huddled under a threadbare blanket, staring into the black expanse of the forest as the faint sounds of children's voices floated through the mist. The crying grew louder, mingling with the sound of a tiny, familiar laugh, a sound that froze my blood. In that moment, I could no longer separate the pain of my loss from the sorrow of these spectral children. I stepped out of the RV, the chill of the night air a sharp contrast to the fever burning within me. I followed the voices, my feet taking me along a narrow, winding path through the forest. Each step was a confrontation with my past, each breath a struggle against overwhelming grief. As I reached a small clearing, I saw them. A cluster of ghostly figures huddled together, their forms barely visible in the pale moonlight that managed to pierce the fog. Among them was a figure that looked eerily like my daughter. Her eyes large and sorrowful, her tiny hand outstretched as if in a silent plea for recognition. I fell to my knees, overcome by emotion. The apparition did not speak, but its eyes conveyed a depth of sadness that resonated with every fiber of my being. I began to speak, my voice trembling as I confessed all the guilt and regret I had harbored for so long. I told them of my failures, of the love that had once filled my life, and of the pain that had become my constant companion. For what felt like hours, I poured my soul out to those spectral children. In that cathartic moment, the air grew still, and the sorrow in their eyes seemed to shift, an acknowledgement of my suffering, a shared understanding of loss. In the silent aftermath of my confession, the ghostly children slowly began to fade. The little girl who resembled my daughter lingered a moment longer, her gaze soft and forgiving, before dissolving into the mist. I remained in the clearing, tears streaming down my face, feeling as though I had finally spoken the words that had long been locked away in the depths of my heart. The clearing, once a stage for sorrow, transformed into a space of quiet absolution. I realized that these apparitions were not here to haunt me with terror, but to remind me of the profound need for closure. A final goodbye that had eluded me for years. With the first light of dawn, the mist began to recede, and I slowly made my way back to the RV, each step lighter than the last. I spent the following days repairing the RV and tidying up the campsite. The oppressive heaviness of the previous nights was replaced by a tentative peace. I continued to document my experiences, but now my journal entries carried not only the weight of grief, but also a budding hope, a belief that perhaps the ghosts of the past could help pave the way for a new beginning. After several days in the mountains, I knew it was time to leave. The RV, which had once been a vessel of isolation and mechanical failures, now symbolized a journey toward redemption. I packed my belongings, leaving behind the clearing where I had confronted the ghosts of lost children and my own buried guilt. As I drove away from the secluded meadow, the early autumn mist gave way to clearer skies, and the oppressive silence of the forest seemed to recede, replaced by the gentle hum of the open road. Yet, even as I left the mountains behind, the echoes of that night lingered. In the quiet moments of the drive, I could almost hear the faint sound of laughter and crying, a reminder of a sorrow that had been both painful and healing. I realized that grief is not something that can simply be banished. It is a part of who we are. But sometimes by facing it head-on, we can find the strength to move forward. Now, months after that fateful trip, I sit in my modest apartment in the city, reflecting on my time in Ouray. The ghostly children have become a bittersweet memory, a symbol of the unresolved tragedies of the past and the personal losses that shape our lives. I still keep my journal, each page a testament to the night when I finally acknowledged my pain and let go of a burden I had carried for far too long. The experience taught me that isolation can be a double-edged sword. In the wilderness, stripped of modern distractions, the mind is free to wander into both dark recesses and unexpected revelations. My journey through the San Juan Mountains was not a quest for escape, but a pilgrimage toward understanding. I learned that sometimes the most haunted places are not those filled with violent specters or malevolent curses, but those where the weight of memory and regret lingers in every whispered wind. The ghost children, with their sorrowful eyes and ephemeral laughter, were not harbingers of terror in the traditional sense. Instead, they were the echoes of lives unfinished, voices of the past that sought recognition and closure. Their presence forced me to confront the deepest parts of my own heart, the parts that had long been silenced by grief. And in that confrontation I found a measure of peace, a chance to honor the memory of what was lost and to begin the slow process of healing. I now understand that the journey to redemption is neither linear nor easy. The mountains of Ouray and the haunted clearing where I once faced my past will forever remain a part of me, a reminder that even in the depths of sorrow, there is room for forgiveness and growth. My name is Daniel, I am 40, and the echoes of the lost continue to whisper in my heart, urging me to remember, to grieve, and ultimately to live. As I continue on this unpredictable path of life, I carry with me the lessons of that autumn in the San Juan Mountains. Every so often, when the wind picks up and the shadows lengthen, I catch a glimpse of something, a flash of a small figure or the sound of distant laughter, and I know that the ghosts are not gone. They are simply a part of the landscape of memory, reminders of the past that guide us toward a future where healing is possible. In the end, my journey was not just about escaping the noise of the world, but about listening to the silent voices within, the voices of those I lost and the parts of myself that needed to be heard. And while the ghostly apparitions of Ouray may fade into the mist with the passing of time, their impact on my soul remains as vivid as the autumn skies over the San Juan Mountains. My name is Laura McKinney, and I'm 42 years old. This happened in late autumn, not long after our lives had been shaken by loss and lingering family strife. My husband Mark, our rebellious teenage daughter Emily, and our curious little son Jake and I decided that an RV camping trip to the remote fringes of the San Juan Mountains near Telluride, Colorado, might mend the broken pieces of our family. We believed that the rugged, wild beauty of nature would offer healing, a chance to reconnect away from the pressures of our daily lives. I wish I could say it was a trip filled only with laughter and bonding moments, but nature and fate had other plans. The drive to the mountains was long and quiet. I remember sitting in the passenger seat of our old RV, its engine rattling like a nervous heartbeat as we made our way through the winding roads. Mark sat behind the wheel, his steady gaze betraying a hint of worry over our dilapidated vehicle. The RV had been with us for years, and its temperamental mechanical issues had become a constant background worry. It sputtered sporadically, and the generator, which we relied on for power in our secluded campsite, had already shown signs of failing even before we reached our destination. Despite these concerns, we pressed on, driven by the hope that nature would provide the solace we so desperately needed. Our arrival at the campsite was marked by a mixture of awe and unease. The San Juan Mountains loomed large and imposing, their peaks capped with the first frosts of winter. We set up camp in a clearing bordered by towering pines that swayed in the chill wind. The isolation was palpable, a double-edged sword that promised both refuge and vulnerability. The first night, as darkness descended and the temperature plummeted, we gathered around a small campfire. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with the distant sound of mournful cries echoing through the pines, a sound that seemed too human, yet too forlorn to be anything natural. I tried to dismiss it as the wind playing tricks with the rocky outcroppings, but deep down, a chill crept up my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Mark, ever the pragmatist, attributed the sounds to wildlife, perhaps a lone coyote or an injured animal calling out. Emily rolled her eyes, but even she couldn't completely mask the anxiety in her eyes. Little Jake, who was only 7, sat wide-eyed, his innocent curiosity mingled with palpable fear. That first night, as the fire's glow danced across our faces, we exchanged uneasy glances. I scribbled down my thoughts in a battered journal later, words forming the beginning of what would become an unforgettable chronicle of terror. The following day, we set out to explore the area around our campsite. Mark insisted on a short hike along a nearby trail that wound its way through ancient groves and rocky outcrops. The day was overcast, the skies a heavy gray, and an inexplicable fog clung to the forest floor. I couldn't help but feel that the very landscape was mourning, the trees whispering secrets of long-forgotten sorrows. As we ambled along the path, we began noticing strange footprints pressed into the mud, prints that were too large, too deliberate, as if someone or something was stalking us. I stopped in my tracks, examining them closely. They didn't resemble the tracks of any animal Mark could think of, nor did they match any pattern I'd ever seen in local lore. Emily snapped a picture on her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she showed it to Mark. "What is that, Mom?" she asked, her voice a mix of intrigue and fear. That evening, back at the campsite, the eerie occurrences began in earnest. Around midnight, when the RV's failing generator struggled to provide even a faint glow, I heard soft, almost rhythmic footsteps circling the RV. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the pattern was too deliberate, too measured. Jake whispered that he saw a lady in white drifting between the trees. I dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination, until I caught a glimpse of a spectral figure through the window. There, standing at a distance, was a woman in a tattered white dress, her face hidden in shadow, her presence exuding a sorrow so deep it seemed to seep into the very air. The next morning, our unease was compounded by the state of our equipment. The RV's engine had stalled unexpectedly during the night, leaving us stranded until Mark managed a temporary fix. His hands were rough and calloused from years of maintaining old machines, but even his skill couldn't shake off the ominous feeling that our mechanical troubles were only the beginning of our misfortune. The generator flickered intermittently, as if struggling against a force it couldn't overcome, plunging us into moments of utter darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. Tensions within our small group began to escalate. Mark and I found ourselves locked in silent disputes, his logical explanations clashing with my increasingly intuitive belief that we were in the midst of something supernatural. "It's just the RV acting up," he would say, but every unexplained sound, every ghostly silhouette, only deepened my conviction that there was a darker force at work. Emily, caught in the middle of our conflict, grew resentful. She longed for independence, but also for the protection we couldn't provide in this inexplicable terror. And little Jake, whose once boundless curiosity had given way to quiet, anxious glances, seemed to carry the weight of fear far beyond his years. As night fell once again, the paranormal occurrences intensified. I awoke to the sound of shattering glass and a sudden, piercing scream. Rushing outside, I found Mark clutching his arm, a shard of glass embedded in his skin from a window that had been violently broken. In the chaos of the moment, I saw her again, the ghostly woman in the white dress, her eyes glimmering with an almost palpable sorrow, her expression twisted in an agonizing blend of longing and fury. In that fleeting instant, I realized that she was not a benign spirit but a dangerous force, one that was both unpredictable and violent. Desperation led us to seek answers from the local community. The next day, despite the lingering effects of last night's terror, we drove to the nearby small town of Ouray. There, in a modest general store, we encountered an elderly local named Mr. Harlan. His weathered face and knowing eyes spoke of a lifetime spent in these mountains, and as he listened to our recounting of events, his expression grew grave. "You're meddling with the spirit of the White Lady," he said softly. "A ghost from our mining past, whose sorrow and anger have never been laid to rest." Mr. Harlan explained that this apparition was tied to an unresolved tragedy from Colorado's early mining days. A woman who had lost her life in a mining accident, her spirit doomed to wander the mountains in perpetual grief. "They say her spirit manifests when the past refuses to stay buried," he added, his voice low and filled with a mix of pity and warning. He mentioned a ritual, one rooted in local indigenous lore that might appease her restless soul. Though the idea of performing a ritual in the midst of our terror was daunting, it was our only hope. Back at our campsite, the atmosphere had grown suffocating. The ghost's appearances had become more frequent and aggressive. Windows shattered without warning. Gusts of frigid wind tore through the RV, and the once faint moans had turned into desperate wails echoing through the forest. Mark, ever the rationalist, now admitted that our experiences defied logical explanation. We gathered around our small, dying campfire that evening, the flames casting long wavering shadows on our tense faces. "We need to do something," I said, my voice trembling yet determined. Mr. Harlan mentioned a ritual, a way to bring her peace. Mark looked at me, his eyes reflecting both disbelief and hope. "It sounds like folklore, Laura," he replied, "but I'm willing to try anything at this point." Emily's eyes flickered with a mix of anger and fear. "So now we're supposed to perform some ghost ritual to fix our problems?" She scoffed. Yet there was an undercurrent of desperation in her tone. Little Jake clutched my hand tightly, his silence speaking volumes. We spent the next day researching everything we could about the local legends, piecing together scraps of lore from old newspapers, library books, and more from Mr. Harlan's accounts. The ritual required us to return to a specific clearing in the woods, a place known locally as Whispering Pines, where the spirit had been sighted most frequently. It involved offering a symbolic tribute, reciting ancient prayers that blended indigenous traditions with local folklore, and a final plea for the spirit to find rest. The night we chose to perform the ritual was especially cold. The wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, and the trees swayed as if in mourning. We packed our supplies, including a few mementos that Mr. Harlan had suggested, a small silver locket, a bundle of sage, and a faded photograph of a young woman from the mining era. Mark drove us to the clearing, and as we stepped out of the RV, the oppressive atmosphere of the woods closed in around us. I led the ritual, my voice wavering at first as I recited the prayers from memory. The others stood in a semicircle around me, their expressions a mix of skepticism and dread. As I spoke, the air grew colder, and the trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal hands reaching for us. Suddenly, a low, mournful wail echoed through the forest, and I saw her, again, the White Lady, her ghostly form emerging from the darkness. This time, her face was more defined, her eyes shimmering with a deep, unyielding sorrow that pierced through the veil between the living and the dead. For a few excruciating moments, time seemed to stand still. The spirit floated closer, her tattered dress billowing in the wind, her presence both tragic and terrifying. Mark instinctively moved to shield us, and Emily's anger was replaced by a look of raw, unfiltered terror. Little Jake began to cry softly, and my heart pounded in my ears. "I beg of you," I continued the ritual, my voice steadying despite the fear, "find peace and let us be." The words felt like a desperate plea, a bridge between our world and hers. The wind intensified, and the spirit's eyes locked onto mine. In that moment, I saw not malice, but an overwhelming grief that spoke of centuries of abandonment and sorrow. Then, as if responding to our heartfelt entreaty, the ghost's form began to dissolve. The temperature in the clearing slowly rose, the oppressive aura lifting like a heavy shroud. For several long minutes we stood in silence, unsure if the spirit had been appeased or if this was merely a pause before further terror. In the days that followed, the supernatural occurrences gradually diminished. The RV continued to struggle with its failing systems, and the isolation of our campsite still pressed upon us. But the relentless assault of ghostly wails and violent apparitions had lessened. Mark's injury, though painful, healed with time, and a tentative sense of normalcy began to return. Yet the memory of that ghostly encounter, the sorrowful eyes of the White Lady, lingered in our minds like a persistent echo. Our time in the San Juan Mountains had transformed us in ways we could never have foreseen. The terror we experienced forced us to confront not only the mysteries of the natural world, but also the hidden fractures within our own family. Mark and I, once at odds over the reality of our experiences, began to understand that logic and intuition are not mutually exclusive. They are complementary forces in the face of the inexplicable. Emily, whose defiance had once been a shield against vulnerability, slowly learned to acknowledge her fears and embrace the unknown with a cautious maturity. And little Jake, once overwhelmed by his vivid imagination, grew more resilient, his innocent curiosity tempered by the harsh lessons of survival. As we packed up our RV to leave the mountains, I took one last look at the clearing of Whispering Pines. I couldn't help but wonder if the spirit had truly found peace, or if the ghost of the White Lady would one day return to remind us that some wounds, both ancient and personal, never truly heal. The memories of that trip would forever be etched into our souls, a stark reminder that the world is full of mysteries beyond our understanding, and that sometimes the line between the living and the dead is far thinner than we dare to believe. Driving away from the campsite, I felt a bittersweet relief. We had survived the terror, but the experience had left its mark on each of us. The mountains had tested our strength and resolve, and in doing so, had brought us closer together. The supernatural presence we encountered was not merely a figment of local folklore. It was a tangible force, dangerous in its capacity to inflict both psychological and physical harm. But it was also a tragic reminder of the past, a story of loss and longing that demanded to be remembered. I still carry that journal with me, a testament to those harrowing nights in the San Juan Mountains. Its pages are filled with the raw emotions of fear, love, and resilience. Each entry serves as a reminder that survival often requires facing the darkness head-on, whether it comes from external forces or the shadows within our own hearts. And sometimes when the wind whistles through the pines on a cold autumn night, I think I can still hear the mournful wail of the White Lady, a spectral lament that ties together the living and the dead in a tapestry of sorrow and hope. Now, as I sit here writing these words, I know that our ordeal in the mountains was more than a brush with the supernatural. It was a journey into the unknown depths of our own souls, and though the terror has subsided, its lessons remain with me, never to dismiss the mysteries of nature, to trust both my intuition and reason, and to cherish the fragile bonds of family that sustain us even in the darkest of times. This experience taught me that sometimes the most frightening encounters are not with monstrous beings, but with the secrets of our own past that refuse to be forgotten. And as I continue to navigate life's winding roads, I do so with the knowledge that even in isolation, we are never truly alone, because the echoes of the past, however painful, are always there to guide us towards healing and understanding. That autumn, in the shadow of the San Juan Mountains, our family faced a horror that transcended the ordinary. And though the scars remain, so does the hope that even the most restless spirits can find peace, and that in the end, love and resilience will triumph over the darkest of forces. My name is Jason Rivers, and I'm 35 years old. This all happened one early spring when I set out in my old RV for a solitary journey into the heart of White River National Forest near Aspen, Colorado. I was running from my past, a past filled with regret, grief, and an ever-present sense of guilt over a tragedy that I couldn't forgive myself for. I believed that by immersing myself in the wild, isolated embrace of nature, I might finally find the solace and redemption my weary soul craved. The journey began on a chilly morning, the remnants of winter still clinging to the mountains as a thin mist swirled around the pines. My RV, a battered but trusty vehicle that had seen better days, rumbled along the winding roads. I'd invested all I had in this trip, hoping that solitude and the quiet whisper of nature would quiet the incessant chatter of my inner demons. Yet, even from the start, the RV hinted at its own unreliability. The navigation system sputtered erratically, and the digital map seemed to shift unexpectedly, as if the roads themselves were trying to hide something from me. Each time I questioned the device's directions, my heart sank a little more into the pit of foreboding isolation. After hours of driving, I finally arrived at a secluded clearing deep in the forest. I parked the RV under a canopy of ancient firs, their trunks standing like silent sentinels. The clearing was small, a natural alcove that seemed untouched by time and strangely silent except for the rustle of wind through leaves. I set up camp with methodical care, each task a small act of rebellion against the despair that had dogged my every step. As night fell, I built a modest fire, its orange glow a fragile defiance against the encroaching dark. I sat alone by the fire, writing in my journal, trying to capture the mix of hope and fear that churned within me. The forest, bathed in moonlight and shadows, seemed almost to breathe. And then, in the silence, I began to hear it. Soft, barely perceptible whispers carried on the wind. At first, I dismissed them as nothing more than the natural sounds of the wilderness. Branches swaying, leaves rustling. But there was something in the cadence of those whispers that felt deliberate, as if the forest itself was trying to communicate with me. The following morning, I set out on foot to explore a bit further from my campsite. My RV's mechanical issues had already surfaced. A warning light on the dashboard flickered ominously as if to remind me that I was utterly alone in this vast wilderness. My steps took me along a narrow, winding trail that cut through dense groves and rocky outcrops. The morning fog lent the landscape an otherworldly quality, softening the edges of reality. It was during this solitary hike that I first noticed strange footprints imprinted in the soft earth near the trail. They were large and deliberate, too human in shape, yet oddly distorted. My pulse quickened as I knelt to inspect them, my mind racing with possibilities. I snapped a picture with my phone, the image blurry yet undeniable. Were these the traces of an animal? Or was something, or someone, lurking in these woods? As I returned to the RV, the day began to darken unexpectedly. Heavy, oppressive clouds rolled in, and the forest seemed to fall into a hush. I tried to shake off the growing dread gnawing at me, blaming it on fatigue and the unsettling solitude of my surroundings. But that evening, as twilight deepened into night, the atmosphere around the RV became palpably charged. I sat by the dying embers of my campfire, scribbling hurried notes into my journal when I heard it again, the sound of rustling footsteps around the vehicle. This time, they were unmistakably deliberate, paced in a pattern that sent shivers down my spine. I remember glancing out the window in the flickering light of my failing generator. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond the tree line. I told myself it was nothing more than an animal disturbed by my presence. Yet, deep down, I sensed that something was watching. Over the course of that restless night, I was haunted by soft murmurs and the eerie sound of my own footsteps echoing back to me, as if accompanied by a phantom presence. In the early hours of the next morning, the RV betrayed me further. Its engine sputtered to a halt just as I was about to embark on another short expedition into the forest. Stranded, and with no immediate means of repair, I was forced to rely on my own limited mechanical skills. With a sense of determination mixed with dread, I rummaged through the toolbox and managed a temporary fix. Still, the whole ordeal left me feeling exposed, trapped in a silent wilderness with only my thoughts for company. That afternoon, seeking answers to the mysteries that now plagued me, I ventured into a small, nearby town. The locals here spoke in hushed tones about legends older than the mountains themselves. In a dimly lit general store, I met an elderly man named Hank, whose eyes seemed to hold the weight of countless secrets. After I recounted my unsettling experiences, the erratic navigation, the strange footprints, the eerie whispers, Hank's face turned solemn. He leaned in and whispered, "You've encountered the Hollow Whisper." I stared at him, uncertain if I'd misheard. Sensing my disbelief, he explained further. According to local lore, the Hollow Whisper was not a mere ghost, but a shape-shifting nature spirit, the tortured soul of a long-forgotten indigenous shaman cursed to wander these woods. Legend held that the spirit was condemned to lure lost souls into confronting the deepest recesses of their own guilt and despair. Hank's voice dropped to a grave tone. They say the Hollow Whisper appears when someone is haunted by regrets too heavy to bear. It's as if the forest mirrors your soul, bringing forth the demons within. His words hit me like a cold wind, resonating with the feelings that had tormented me for years. Returning to my RV with Hank's ominous warning echoing in my mind, I began to notice that the supernatural manifestations were intensifying. The strange whispers had evolved into indistinct voices that seemed to call out my name in moments of quiet solitude. Flickering, distant lights danced among the trees at night, and the sensation of being followed became impossible to ignore. I was trapped between an internal battle with my own memories and the external horrors that the forest now seemed to conjure. One night, after a long, disquieting day of restless wandering and sleepless contemplation, I found myself drawn away from the relative safety of the RV. The fog was thick, and the landscape blurred into an abstract tapestry of shapes and shadows. In this disoriented state, I stumbled upon a hidden clearing bathed in an ethereal, silvery light. The air here was unnervingly still, as if nature itself were holding its breath. And there, in the center of the clearing, I saw it, a vague silhouette that seemed to shift and blur at the edges. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was face to face with the Hollow Whisper. For a long, agonizing moment, I stood frozen as the spirit's form wavered in and out of focus. In one moment, it resembled a dark, formless mass. In the next, I saw the features of an ancient shaman, his eyes filled with unspeakable sorrow and regret. The spirit seemed to study me, its gaze penetrating as though it could see into the very depths of my soul. I felt an overwhelming rush of memories, moments of failure, loss, and guilt that I had spent years trying to bury. The realization was brutal. The Hollow Whisper was not here to merely haunt me. It was here to force me to confront my own inner darkness. In that silent clearing, with the ghostly figure looming before me, I was overcome by a paralyzing mix of terror and clarity. The spirit's presence was both violent and mesmerizing, its energy pulsing with an ancient power. I realized that there was no escaping this encounter. I had to face the painful truths I'd long denied. With a trembling voice, I began to speak, first to the spirit, then to myself. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry for the pain I caused, for the lives I couldn't save." The confession, raw and unfiltered, echoed through the clearing. The Hollow Whisper reacted in a way I could barely comprehend. Its form seemed to soften, the harsh lines of anguish melting into a more subdued, mournful outline. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there in a silent communion, a man and a spirit, both bearing the scars of unbearable loss. As I continued my confession, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, as if each word released a fragment of the guilt that had bound me for so long. In that moment, the oppressive atmosphere that had shrouded the forest began to dissipate. The silvery light receded, and the once ominous clearing returned to its natural state, bathed in the gentle glow of the moon. I knew then that the ritual of confession and self-forgiveness had somehow appeased the Hollow Whisper, that the spirit's tortured presence had found a temporary solace in my willingness to confront my inner demons. I made my way back to the RV with a new sense of clarity, though I remained deeply unsettled by the intensity of the encounter. Over the following days, the manifestations gradually faded, the whispers receded, and the strange lights in the trees became rare and fleeting. Still, the forest never truly returned to normal. Every rustle in the underbrush, every unexpected gust of wind served as a reminder that the supernatural was never far away. I spent those remaining days documenting everything in my journal and updating my blog with a series of raw, unfiltered posts about my experiences. I wrote about the malfunctioning navigation system, the eerie footprints, and most importantly, the transformative encounter with the Hollow Whisper. The process of writing became cathartic, each word a step toward healing, each page a testament to the night I had finally faced my past. The RV, stubborn and unreliable as ever, continued to remind me of my vulnerability. Its mechanical issues persisted, and I knew that soon I'd have to leave this isolated refuge behind. Yet, as I prepared to depart from the forest, I couldn't help but feel that the experience had altered me irrevocably. I had journeyed deep into a place where the line between reality and nightmare blurred, and in doing so, I had discovered a strength within myself that I never knew existed. On my final morning in the forest, I sat outside the RV, watching the sun rise over the towering peaks. The sky was a canvas of soft pinks and deep blues, and for a brief moment, the forest felt serene, an echo of a long-forgotten peace. I took one last deep breath of the crisp, cold air, knowing that the memories of my encounter would forever be etched in my mind. There was a lingering whisper in the wind, almost imperceptible, that seemed to bid me farewell. A final acknowledgement from the hollow whisper. Driving away, I couldn't help but glance back at the forest one last time. I wondered if the spirit would ever truly be laid to rest, or if it would continue to haunt the woods, waiting for the next lost soul burdened by guilt to wander into its midst. I knew one thing for certain. I had been forever changed. The confrontation with the hollow whisper had forced me to face the darkness inside me, and though the journey was painful, it had also been liberating. Now, as I continue on my travels, I carry the lessons of that eerie spring day with me. I've learned that redemption often lies in the acceptance of one's deepest flaws, and that sometimes the only way to move forward is to confront the ghosts of the past head-on. The wilderness is a place of both beauty and danger, a realm where the natural and the supernatural coexist in a delicate balance. And while I no longer feel the same crushing weight of guilt, I remain ever vigilant, aware that the mysteries of the forest are as endless as the stars in the night sky. My journey through the White River National Forest taught me that isolation can be both a curse and a blessing. It forces us to confront what we most fear, but it also provides the space for growth and renewal. The Hollow Whisper, with its tragic history and tormented soul, was a mirror reflecting my own inner struggles. In its mournful gaze, I found not condemnation, but an invitation to forgive myself and let go of the past. Today, as I write these words in my journal during another solitary night on the road, I still hear faint echoes of that early spring. The sound of the wind through the pines, the rustle of leaves, and the soft murmur of distant voices remind me that the wilderness never forgets. And though the road ahead is uncertain, I move forward with a cautious hope and a deep respect for the natural and supernatural forces that shape our lives. I remain forever grateful for that encounter in the hidden clearing, a moment of intense fear that blossomed into a journey of self-forgiveness and transformation. And as I drive into the unknown, I know that the lessons I learned in the heart of White River National Forest will continue to guide me, reminding me that even in the deepest darkness, there is always a spark of light waiting to be rekindled. My name is Marcus Reed, and I'm 34 years old. This happened in the fall of 2023, when my friends and I decided to escape the suffocating routine of city life and seek solace in the rugged wilderness of Silver Creek in the San Juan National Forest, Colorado. I had inherited an old RV from my uncle, a relic that I'd always seen as a key to adventure, and I was determined to prove that nothing could stop us from a weekend of freedom and excitement. I was the de facto leader of our small group, though I'd soon learned that nature and the supernatural can humble even the most confident among us. The journey began with high spirits. Hannah Ortiz, our pragmatic planner and resident tech-savvy researcher, had mapped out the route, promising us remote trails and breathtaking views. Ben Carter, the ever-supportive and good-humored friend, brought a lightness to our banter, even as I sensed the faint tremors of his underlying anxiety. And then there was Lisa Monroe, our quiet, introspective soul with an uncanny intuition for things beyond the ordinary. She had warned us, with soft, almost inaudible hints, that this trip might not be as simple as it seemed. As we drove through the winding mountain roads, the crisp autumn air filled our lungs and the scenery shifted from golden aspens to deep, mysterious evergreens. Our destination, a secluded clearing near Silver Creek, was nothing short of idyllic, a perfect blend of isolation and nature's raw beauty. However, the RV, which I'd cherished as our escape vehicle, began showing its age almost immediately. Not long after setting up camp, the RV's radio crackled with static and then fell silent, and the GPS started misbehaving, flickering between coordinates. Worse yet, as we set out to explore the immediate surroundings, the engine sputtered ominously, leaving us stranded in the heart of the forest. I tried to reassure everyone that I could fix it, but even as I popped the hood, the worry etched on Hannah's face told me that maybe this was not just bad luck. In the days that followed, tensions rose along with our growing isolation. Hannah insisted that we should have waited for professional help rather than venturing out further, while I argued that our adventure was just beginning. Ben, whose jovial nature usually lightened any mood, became increasingly jittery, his laughter replaced by anxious glances into the dense, looming forest. Lisa, meanwhile, seemed to drift between the camp's circle of light and the encroaching darkness, as if she were in tune with secrets hidden in the trees. One chilly evening, just as dusk began to bleed into night, we gathered around a small, crackling campfire. The woods around us were silent, too silent, and that silence was quickly broken by something inexplicable. I remember glancing at Lisa, who had gone quiet and fixed her gaze into the dark, as if trying to decipher the forest's murmurs. Then, without warning, she whispered, "Something isn't right." Her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and anticipation, and even as I brushed it off as the product of an overactive imagination, a cold shiver ran down my spine. That night, as the fire died down to embers, we began noticing strange, oversized footprints near the RV. They were too large and oddly contoured, not matching any animal we were familiar with. In the soft glow of our makeshift lanterns, we also saw intricate carvings on the trees, spiral symbols and cryptic runes that none of us could identify. I tried to laugh it off, attributing it to local pranksters, but deep down I felt that these signs were an omen. As I lay in the cramped bunk of the RV later that night, the silence was broken by faint, almost imperceptible whispering voices that seemed to echo from the depths of the forest. The words were indistinct, a jumble of sounds that made no sense yet stirred a primal fear within me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. The following day, with our spirits dampened by unease, we attempted to fix the RV's engine. Tools were scattered, tempers flared, and every minor setback added fuel to the simmering tension. Hannah's practical suggestions clashed with my determination to forge ahead, and even Ben's usually buoyant demeanor was replaced by a visible anxiety that made the air heavy. Amid the frustration, Lisa kept silent, her eyes constantly drawn to the shadowy tree line, as if she sensed an imminent danger that we refused to acknowledge. That evening, as the sun dipped below the towering pines, the forest seemed to come alive with a malevolent presence. Out on a routine patrol of the perimeter, I caught a glimpse of something, an indistinct figure moving between the trees. I called out, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Later, while securing our meager supplies, Ben screamed as something scratched at the side of the RV. Rushing outside, we discovered deep gouges in the metal that looked far too deliberate to be the work of wild animals. The scratches, coupled with the eerie signs we'd been witnessing, forced us to confront the possibility that we were no longer alone. In a hurried discussion around the fire, Lisa finally spoke up in a trembling voice. "I think it's a skinwalker," she said. "I've read about them. Shape-shifting entities from Navajo legend, said to be malevolent forces that roam these backwoods." Her words hung in the cold night air, mingling with the crackling embers and the creeping dread that had settled over us. The skinwalker, she explained, was not merely a spectral presence, but an active, violent force that could change shape at will, sometimes appearing human, other times resembling a wild, predatory animal. Determined to understand what we were facing, Hannah and I pooled our resources, that little cell phone service, and a few old books we found in the RV. By candlelight, we learned that local lore had long spoken of such entities. The legends, a blend of indigenous myths and local superstitions, warned that these beings were drawn to disturbances in nature, like the intrusion of modern man, and could be warded off by traditional rituals. Salt lines, sage smudging, and specific chants were said to repel their unholy influence. Despite our internal disagreements, we agreed on a desperate plan: to create protective boundaries around our camp using salt and sage, and to recite the ancient chants we'd painstakingly copied from one of the dusty tomes. We prepared for a night-long vigil, each of us aware that the darkness might bring the full force of the supernatural. That night, the atmosphere was thick with foreboding. I remember the clock striking midnight, each chime echoing like a death knell. The forest was unusually still, the silence punctuated by our anxious whispers and the rustle of leaves. Suddenly, a blood-curdling howl shattered the calm, a sound that sent a primal terror through our veins. The RV shook violently, and we all froze, hearts pounding in our chests. From the shadows emerged the skinwalker, its form shifting before our eyes. At first, it appeared as a dark, hulking figure with the outline of a man, but then its limbs elongated and its face contorted into something both human and beast. The creature's eyes burned with an unholy fire, and its presence exuded an aura of malice that chilled us to the bone. I felt the urge to run, but my mind screamed at me to protect my friends. "Stand your ground," I shouted, rallying the group. Hannah took charge of the protective rituals, scattering salt around the perimeter of our camp while Ben fumbled with the sage, his hands trembling. Lisa, with her almost otherworldly calm, began reciting the chants in a language that none of us fully understood. The skinwalker's assault was sudden and brutal. It lunged towards Ben with a speed that defied belief, its claws slashing through the air. Ben cried out as it grazed his arm, drawing blood. I leaped forward, my instincts overriding my fear, and swung a heavy metal pipe at the creature. The blow seemed to slow it momentarily, but the skinwalker quickly recovered, its form melting and reassembling with a terrifying fluidity. For what felt like an eternity, we clashed with the entity. The air was filled with the sound of frantic chanting, the hiss of the wind, and the guttural growls of the creature. Every instinct in my body screamed for survival as I fought to keep the creature at bay. I could see the determination in Hannah's eyes and the raw fear mingled with resolve on Ben's face. Even Lisa, usually so reserved, exuded a fierce intensity as she continued the incantations. I wasn't sure how long the struggle lasted. Time became an indistinct blur of adrenaline and terror. At one point, I was thrown against a tree, my vision swimming with pain and shock. The creature circled me like a predator stalking its prey, its eyes fixed on mine. In that frozen moment, I felt as though the darkness itself was reaching out to claim me. But then a sudden surge of resolve filled me. I remembered every warning, every story, and every piece of advice we'd gathered, and I channeled that into a desperate bid to survive. "By the spirits of this land, I command you to retreat," I roared, my voice echoing through the still night. It was a phrase I'd read in one of the old books, a final plea to the forces that governed this cursed territory. For a split second, the skinwalker hesitated, its form wavering in the flickering light of our ritual circle. Then, with a guttural snarl, it recoiled, melting back into the shadows of the forest. When the creature finally disappeared, the forest seemed to exhale a long-held breath. The silence that followed was no longer oppressive, but rather heavy with the aftermath of a battle fought on the edge of sanity. We huddled together near the smoldering remnants of our fire, our hearts still pounding in our chests. Ben's arm was bandaged hastily, and Hannah's eyes were red-rimmed from crying and intense concentration. Lisa simply stared into the darkness, as if trying to make sense of the lingering presence that still clung to the air. In the dim light of the early morning, we assessed the damage. The RV bore fresh scars, deep, menacing gouges that testified to the violence of the night. Our supplies were scattered, and the protective salt lines had been disturbed. Yet, in spite of everything, we had survived. The skinwalker, as horrifying as it had been, had retreated into the vast, unforgiving wilderness, leaving us with more questions than answers. We spent the rest of the day consolidating our resources and attempting to contact help. The RV's broken engine and malfunctioning radio were still a challenge, but now our priority was to ensure that we were safe until rescue arrived. Hannah's earlier research proved invaluable, as we pieced together more of the local lore and found that similar encounters had been recorded over the years. Tragic, violent events that seemed to recur in these remote parts of Colorado. In the days that followed, while waiting for professional help to repair the RV and get us out of Silver Creek, we sat around a hastily rebuilt campfire, each of us lost in our own reflections. I couldn't shake the image of the skinwalker's eyes, the burning, malevolent gaze that had seemed to peer into the darkest parts of my soul. I recalled the way our group had come together in the face of unspeakable terror, each person contributing in their own way despite our differences. Hannah's pragmatic nature had grounded us. Ben's vulnerability had reminded us that fear was a shared human experience, and Lisa's intuitive warnings had ultimately saved our lives. I often wondered if the creature was merely a manifestation of our collective anxieties, the dark aspects of the wilderness that we had somehow brought to life. But deep down, I knew that there was something real and ancient in those woods, something that defied the neat explanations of modern science. The legends of skinwalkers were rooted in the histories and cultures of the indigenous peoples, and though we were far from their homelands, their stories resonated in the twisted branches and shadowed clearings of Silver Creek. In our subsequent days of forced isolation, we made a pact. We would return to civilization with our story intact, a cautionary tale for those who sought to tread the line between human ambition and the ancient, wild forces that govern nature. Our ordeal had left us changed, scarred, yes, but also more aware of the fragile boundary between our everyday reality and the inexplicable mysteries of the natural world. Eventually, help arrived. The RV was towed to a nearby town, and local authorities began their investigation into the strange occurrences at our campsite. While some dismissed our tale as a series of unfortunate coincidences exacerbated by our own mounting tensions and a failing vehicle, others listened with a mixture of skepticism and awe. I never forgot the look in Lisa's eyes as she recounted her premonitions, or the way Ben's trembling hand clutched mine during the showdown. As for me, I continued to wrestle with the knowledge of what we encountered, The memory of that night is seared into my mind. The echo of ancient chants, the smell of burning sage, and the unmistakable presence of a force that was both unnatural and terrifyingly real. I have since learned that survival in the wilderness is not solely about physical endurance or mechanical reliability, but also about confronting the unknown with a blend of rationality, intuition, and raw human courage. Now, whenever I pass through the winding roads of Colorado, I can't help but glance into the darkened tree lines, half expecting to see those burning eyes watching me from the shadows. And though I have moved on with my life, the lessons of Silver Creek remain a constant reminder that in the deep, isolated places of our world, the past and the supernatural are never truly at rest. In the end, our encounter with the Skinwalker taught me that sometimes the most harrowing battles are fought not with weapons or force, but with the courage to face the unseen. It is a story I share not for the thrill of the tale, but as a solemn reminder that even in moments of isolation, when the boundaries between myth and reality blur, our very survival depends on our willingness to confront the darkness within and around us. My name is Anna Sullivan, and I'm 29 years old. This happened in the spring of 2022, when I decided to leave behind a painful past and seek solace on the lonely roads of Colorado. I had recently lost my younger brother in an accident that still haunts my every waking moment, and with an aching heart, I resolved to find healing in solitude. I set out in my old, self-renovated RV toward the outskirts of Mesa Verde National Park, heading for the abandoned mining town of Silver Hollow, a place rumored to be steeped in local legends and ghostly mysteries. After hours of driving along winding mountain roads, I finally arrived at Silver Hollow. The town's faded remnants peeked out from behind crumbling facades and weathered signs. I parked my RV on a graveled lot on the edge of town, where the sparse light of a dying sun filtered through towering junipers and scattered pines. The isolation was palpable, a silence so deep it pressed against my ears. I hoped that in this forsaken place I could confront my inner demons and find a measure of peace. The RV, though lovingly refurbished, proved temperamental almost immediately. The power flickered as I set up camp, and my phone, which I depended on for any connection to the modern world, stubbornly refused to catch a signal. I chalked it up to the remoteness of the area, a fitting backdrop for a journey of self-discovery. With a heavy heart and a mixture of trepidation and hope, I unpacked my few belongings and settled in for the night. That first night was unsettling in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I remember lying awake in the narrow berth of the RV, the darkness outside punctuated by the occasional rustle of wind through the dying pines. Just as I was drifting into an uneasy sleep, I heard it. A sound that froze me in place. Distant laughter, high-pitched and fleeting, echoed across the cold, empty landscape. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, but then came a soft, almost imperceptible weeping. It was as if tiny voices were caught between sobs and laughter, a blend of joy and sorrow that tugged at my heart. Unable to sleep, I stepped outside. The chill of the night air embraced me as I peered into the inky blackness. For a brief moment I saw them, ghostly silhouettes of children darting between the sparse trees, their small forms illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. Their faces, if they could be called that, were etched with both wonder and a deep, lingering sorrow. I stood frozen, my heart pounding, as the laughter and weeping swirled around me like a mournful lullaby. I couldn't tell if they were harmless spirits or lost souls bound to this place by tragedy. The next morning, determined to understand what I had witnessed, I began to explore the area around my RV. The gravel crunching under my boots and the soft murmur of a nearby creek provided a fragile sense of normalcy. In the remnants of an old mining building, I discovered dusty diaries and yellowed newspapers that recounted the town's grim past. The records told of a catastrophic mining accident decades ago, a disaster that claimed the lives of many, including several children. What struck me most was the recurring mention of a woman, a witch by local accounts, who was said to have cursed the town in a fit of vengeful despair. The diaries described how the witch had been accused of practicing dark magic, blamed for the misfortunes that befell Silver Hollow. According to the local lore, her curse bound the souls of the children who perished in the mine, condemning them to wander the ruins in eternal sorrow. I couldn't shake the feeling that my own grief, my unspoken guilt over my brother's untimely death, had drawn me here, to a place where past and present collided in the most spectral of ways. That evening, as dusk bled into a starless night, I prepared myself for another restless night. The RV's failing equipment was the least of my worries now. The true terror was what might emerge from the darkness. I sat on a creaking wooden chair outside, a small lantern in hand, and began to notice things that deepened the uncanny atmosphere. At first, it was the persistent echo of children's laughter, now clearer, more insistent than before. But it wasn't just the laughter. I began to hear soft voices, snippets of conversation that vanished as quickly as they arrived. In the distance, I caught sight of little figures, their silhouettes flitting in and out of the tree line. I attempted to follow them, but each time I got closer, they evaporated into the swirling mist. Then came the appearance of another presence. One night, while I was scribbling notes in a tattered journal about the town's history, I saw a shadow move along the edge of the RV's light. It was not a child's form, but that of a woman, a spectral figure with eyes that burned like embers. Her presence was commanding, laced with an air of melancholy and malice. I felt both drawn to and repelled by her. She was as much a part of this tragic narrative as the lost souls of the children. Unable to ignore the growing intensity of the supernatural occurrences, I turned once more to the diaries and local documents I'd collected. By the light of a flickering candle, I pieced together the story of the witch, a woman once ostracized and maligned by the townspeople. The curse, as the records indicated, was not an act of pure evil, but a bitter outcry of despair and revenge against a community that had wronged her. In her final hours, she had invoked a dark power to bind the souls of the innocent children to Silver Hollow, a twisted mechanism to ensure that her own suffering would echo through the generations. The more I read, the more I realized that the spectral children were manifestations of a curse that was both ancient and deeply intertwined with the land. And in a cruel twist of fate, the curse seemed to resonate with my own inner torment, the unresolved grief and guilt that had haunted me since my brother's death. A heavy storm rolled in one fateful night, shrouding Silver Hollow in oppressive darkness. The wind howled like the cries of the damned, and rain battered the RV in relentless sheets. I sat inside, clutching my journal and trying to steady my trembling hands, when I heard a knock at the door. Startled, I opened it to find no one there, only the swirling wind and the echo of footsteps that vanished into the tempest. Venturing out into the storm, I felt a magnetic pull toward the ruins of the old mine. It was there that I sensed the full weight of the curse, as if the very earth beneath my feet was crying out in anguish. With each step, the spectral phenomena grew more vivid. The ghostly children appeared again, their forms now more distinct, their eyes brimming with unspeakable sorrow. And looming behind them was the shadowy figure of the witch, her presence now undeniable and overpowering. Under the tempest's wrath, I reached the crumbling entrance of the mine. The darkness inside was complete, an abyss that swallowed even the faintest glimmers of light. I hesitated at the threshold, the memories of my brother's face mingling with the horror of the scene before me. This was a place where the past refused to die, a place where the pain of loss and the weight of regret had taken on a tangible form. Inside the mine, I found myself surrounded by apparitions. The spectral children, once playful and fleeting, now gathered in solemn clusters, their faces etched with despair. And at the center of this spectral congregation stood the witch, a gaunt figure with eyes like burning coals and a voice that resonated with both fury and profound sorrow. "Why have you come?" she demanded, her tone echoing off the cold stone walls. Her words were not merely an accusation, they were a challenge, a call for accountability that struck deep into the recesses of my heart. I took a trembling breath and replied, I'm here to find forgiveness. I carry a heavy guilt over my brother's death. I'm not asking you to forgive me, but I need to understand. I need to release this pain." Her eyes softened for just a moment, as if my words had pierced the armor of her bitterness. "The curse you seek to break is bound by the sorrow of this land," she intoned. "The children you see are not mere ghosts. They are remnants of lives lost in tragedy, echoing the grief of those who cannot let go." I fell to my knees, overcome by the enormity of the moment. In that cavernous darkness, I felt the weight of every regret, every memory of loss. The witch's presence seemed to envelop me, and the spectral voices grew louder, urging me to confront the anguish that had haunted me for so long. Driven by a surge of raw emotion, I pleaded, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. My brother's death, for not letting go of the past. I carry this guilt with me every day, and it's tearing me apart." My voice, cracking under the strain of years of suppressed sorrow, reverberated through the mine. I continued, "Please, let me help release these lost souls. Let me free myself from this burden." The witch's eyes glowed with a fierce intensity as she regarded me silently. In that suspended moment, it felt as though the entire mine held its breath. Slowly, she reached out a hand, her gesture both menacing and tender, and beckoned me closer. "Your pain is the key," she whispered. "Only by accepting your sorrow can you break this curse and free these souls." With tears streaming down my face, I reached out and placed my hand in hers. The contact sent a shock of icy energy through my body, a torrent of memories, grief, and the overwhelming power of collective loss. I saw visions of the children's lives, brief moments of laughter and innocence now forever tarnished by tragedy. I saw my brother's smiling face, a reminder of what I had lost and the crushing guilt that had shadowed every day since. In that intimate and harrowing exchange, I understood what I had to do. I began to recite words I had found in one of the diaries, a plea for forgiveness and a prayer for release. My voice, though shaky, grew steadier with each word. The witch's form flickered in response, as if the very fabric of her being was tied to the sorrow that gripped the mine. The ghostly children gathered closer, their luminous eyes fixed on me, and a strange silence fell over the cavern. As the final word left my lips, the oppressive weight of the curse seemed to lift. The spectral figures quivered, and one by one, the ghostly children began to fade, their mournful faces softening into expressions of peace. The witch's presence, too, diminished, her burning eyes now a gentle ember of resigned sorrow. I felt the grip of my own grief loosening, as if the act of confronting my guilt had set both the spirits and myself free. In the quiet that followed, the storm outside subsided, leaving the mine eerily silent except for the soft drip of water along its ancient walls. I remained there for what felt like hours, my body trembling not from fear, but from the cathartic release of a burden long carried. When I finally emerged from the mine, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting a gentle glow over Silver Hollow. I returned to my RV, my heart lighter yet still marked by the scars of the night's ordeal. The equipment remained temperamental, a persistent reminder that even in the modern age, nature's mysteries and ancient curses could disrupt our technological reliance. I knew that I could not stay in Silver Hollow forever, but I also knew that I had taken the first step toward healing. In the following days, as I waited for my RV to be repaired by a traveling mechanic, I documented everything in my journal. The ghostly apparitions, the haunted whispers, and my own journey through guilt and redemption. I reached out to local historians and even visited the remnants of the mining community to gather more of the town's tragic history. Each story, each recollection confirmed that Silver Hollow was a place where the past and the present converged in ways that defied rational explanation. Eventually, with the RV repaired and a sense of cautious optimism in my heart, I left Silver Hollow behind. I drove away with a bittersweet feeling, relief at having faced the darkness and a lingering sadness for the souls who had suffered so long in silence. The ghostly children and the witch's mournful gaze would forever be etched into my memory, serving as a reminder that sometimes the only way to move forward is to confront the pain of the past head-on. As I journeyed back to civilization, I found that the experiences in Silver Hollow had changed me. The constant echo of loss had been replaced, at least in part, by a sense of release and hope. I learned that the healing process is not linear, and that sometimes the most harrowing experiences can ultimately lead to a deeper understanding of oneself. Now, whenever I travel alone in my RV or pass through quiet, isolated stretches of road, I carry the lessons of Silver Hollow with me. I remember that confrontation with grief, no matter how painful, can break curses, both supernatural and personal. And even though the road ahead may be fraught with uncertainty, I know that facing the darkness within is the first step toward finding the light. I share this story not as a tale of terror, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The ghostly echoes in the midnight grove, the sorrowful laughter of children long lost, and the spectral figure of a witch seeking redemption. All these have become part of my journey. A reminder that every ending, no matter how tragic, holds the possibility of a new beginning. In the end, Silver Hollow was more than just a haunted relic of the past. It was a crucible where my own pain was confronted, transformed, and ultimately released. And as I continue down the winding roads of life, I do so with a quieter heart, forever changed by the echoes in the midnight grove. My name is Jack Mitchell. I'm 38 years old, and this happened one bitter autumn in the remote reaches of the San Juan Mountains near Pagosa Springs, Colorado. I had always been a man of restless spirit, drawn to isolation and the rugged beauty of nature. My old RV, a relic that had seen better days, had become my trusted companion on many journeys. I'd hoped that this trip, shared with Lydia Rivera, a sensitive soul with an insatiable curiosity for the local legends, would provide both an escape from urban chaos and a chance to rediscover parts of myself I'd long neglected. We set off on a crisp October morning. The RV's engine coughed and sputtered as if protesting the long, winding roads ahead. Despite its creaks and groans, I was determined to push forward. Lydia, whose eyes sparkled with both excitement and trepidation, clutched a worn leather notebook filled with notes on indigenous folklore and ghost stories from the area. She was fascinated by the whispered tales of a cursed witch whose spirit was said to wander these mountains, a presence that locals only dared to mention in hushed tones. Our plan was simple. Head north into the mountains, park the RV near a secluded clearing in the San Juan National Forest, and spend a few days away from the distractions of modern life. We'd explore nearby trails, gather stories from the locals, and immerse ourselves in the stark wilderness. Little did I know, the true nature of the land would soon make us question every step we took. When we finally arrived at a small town on the edge of the forest, the locals' demeanor was cautious, their glances wary. At a modest diner, an old man with a weathered face leaned in and whispered, "You folks best be careful out there. There's been strange happenings, ghostly figures, eerie sounds at night. Things best left alone." His eyes darted around, as if expecting shadows to leap from the corners. Lydia scribbled down every word, her fingers trembling slightly on the pen. That night, back at the RV, the isolation of the remote parking spot began to weigh on me. The RV's engine refused to start properly after a long drive, and a failing generator left us scrambling for heat as the temperature plummeted. In the distance, the wind howled against the trees, carrying what sounded like faint, sorrowful whispers. At first, I dismissed them as tricks of the wind, but as the hours passed, those whispers began to coalesce into something far more ominous. The following day, Lydia and I decided to explore a nearby trail that wound through the forest. The path was lined with ancient pines whose twisted limbs reached out like skeletal hands. As we ventured deeper, I noticed odd symbols etched into the bark of the trees and carved into large, flat stones. The markings were unfamiliar, yet they resonated with the indigenous lore Lydia had been researching. She explained that such symbols were often used in old rituals, a silent plea or warning to the spirits that dwelled within the land. As the afternoon faded into twilight, a chill that wasn't entirely due to the autumn air crept over me. Lydia's intuition, ever sensitive, began to whisper that we were not alone. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig echoed like a forewarning. When I glanced to Lydia, I saw her eyes widen as she too sensed the encroaching unease. That night, in the confines of our cramped RV, the generator's intermittent hum provided a feeble comfort. But as the darkness deepened, a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature sent shivers down my spine. I opened the door, peering into the inky blackness beyond. At the edge of the clearing, a pale, ghostly figure drifted among the trees, a woman clad in dark, tattered robes. For a moment she stood still, her eyes locking onto mine with a mix of sorrow and malevolence. Then, as abruptly as she appeared, she vanished into the darkness. I couldn't sleep that night. The image of the spectral woman with her hollow gaze and silent warning haunted my every thought. By dawn, Lydia was already up, poring over her notes. "Jack," she said softly, "there's something in these stories." They say her name was Elvira, a witch who was burned at the stake centuries ago, cursed to wander these lands in eternal agony. I felt a growing dread settle in my gut. The warnings of the old diner, the mysterious symbols, and now this apparition. Everything was converging into a nightmare that we could neither escape nor ignore. Our next step was clear, albeit terrifying. Lydia insisted that we visit a local Native American elder, a man reputed to possess wisdom about the ancient curses and rituals of the area. With my reluctant consent, we drove to a small reservation a short distance away. The elder, a dignified man with eyes that had seen too much sorrow, listened intently to our tale. In measured tones, he explained that Elvira's spirit was tethered to the land by an ancient curse, a dark remnant of historical injustices committed long ago. He warned that her anger was not just a spectral lament, but a malevolent force capable of manifesting physical violence. His words were clear. Unless appeased through a long-forgotten ritual, her wrath would continue to haunt, even destroy, those who dared disturb her domain. Returning to the forest, we found that our troubles had only deepened. The RV, already temperamental, now suffered a critical failure. The generator had completely died, plunging us into darkness as the biting cold set in. That night, as I sat huddled in the RV, I could hear the sound of something heavy scraping against the exterior. Then came the whispers again, now louder, insistent, as if multiple voices were urging us to leave, to run. Suddenly, an unearthly wind battered the RV, throwing objects against the walls. I barely dodged a flying piece of metal that nearly struck me. Lydia's frantic cries punctuated the cacophony, and I realized that this was no mere haunting. The force behind these phenomena was violently real. As the night wore on, the supernatural presence grew bolder. The spectral figure of Elvira reappeared, her form more defined, her eyes burning with a terrible intensity. In a moment that defied explanation, she reached out as if trying to grasp me. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding in my ears, and managed to barricade the door with a hastily retrieved piece of lumber. The violence of the encounter left no doubt. Elvira was dangerous, and her anger was not a passive, lingering sorrow. It was a tempest of dark energy, one that threatened to tear apart everything in its path. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around our makeshift camp grew increasingly oppressive. Lydia and I found ourselves at odds. Her insistence on understanding and appeasing the supernatural force clashed with my survival instinct to escape and fortify. The tension between us was palpable, a boiling cauldron of fear, anger, and despair. Every disagreement, every cold glance added to the growing isolation we both felt. Yet, despite the strain, we knew that working together was our only chance. With the elders' cryptic advice echoing in our minds, we began to piece together the ritual that might end Elvira's curse. The ritual required us to confront our deepest fears, to accept the painful truths of our past, and to symbolically atone for them. I was skeptical, but as the nights grew darker and the attacks more violent, desperation began to override my doubts. We spent long, sleepless hours gathering the necessary items, a collection of herbs, a ceremonial bowl, and a set of symbols that needed to be traced onto the ground. Each element was painstakingly tied to ancient lore, its purpose both protective and propitiatory. Lydia's determination never wavered. Her gentle persistence was the only thing keeping me from surrendering to panic. I, in turn, resolved to focus on survival, gathering every scrap of practical knowledge I had from years spent in the wilderness. The final piece of the puzzle was to confront the ghostly presence head-on. We chose a clearing deep in the forest, where the symbols we had seen earlier were most densely marked on trees and stones. The night of the ritual, the air was thick with anticipation and a chilling stillness that belied the storm brewing within. With the moon hidden behind dense clouds, we arranged our makeshift altar in the center of the clearing. Lydia's hands trembled as she carefully laid out the herbs and the ceremonial bowl. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. The ritual demanded that we both acknowledge our inner demons, the regrets, the losses, and the secrets we had long tried to bury. As we began, the atmosphere shifted. The oppressive chill deepened, and the wind seemed to whisper our darkest fears. I found myself speaking aloud the confessions of a past I'd always tried to escape. The faces of those I'd lost, the mistakes I'd made. Lydia's voice, though soft, was resolute as she recounted her own tormented memories. With every word, the air grew heavier, as if our collective sorrow was fueling something beyond our control. Then, as if summoned by our admission, Elvira's presence became undeniable. A swirl of dark mist coalesced at the edge of the clearing, and the spectral figure emerged once again. This time, she did not hesitate. Her eyes burned with a fierce, unholy light as she circled our makeshift altar. The wind howled in protest, and the ground trembled beneath our feet. In that terrifying moment, I realized that this was not a simple haunting or a passive specter. Elvira was a force of nature, a vengeful spirit, wrought from centuries of anguish and injustice. The violent gusts that had plagued us the night before returned with renewed ferocity. Objects flew through the air. The trees themselves seemed to sway in mourning and malice. I clutched Lydia's hand as we continued the ritual, our voices mingling with the sound of the storm. Every incantation, every symbolic act, was an attempt to pierce the veil between our mortal realm and the tormented spirit's domain. In the midst of the chaos, I felt as though the boundaries between life and death were disintegrating. The intensity of our shared fear and resolve created a palpable aura, one that defied the natural order. For what felt like an eternity, the battle was not one of physical blows, but of wills. Elvira's spectral form thrashed and raged against our incantations, her presence both sorrowful and vengeful. At one point, she lunged forward with an almost human desperation, her hands reaching out to drag me into the abyss of her despair. I fought back with every ounce of strength, both physically and emotionally, refusing to let her claim another soul. As the final words of the ritual faded into the night, there was a moment of profound silence. The wind died down, and the oppressive cold began to lift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Elvira's form began to dissipate, like mist in the morning sun. I could not tell if she was retreating, appeased by our contrition, or if she was merely biding her time, waiting for another chance to reappear. Lydia and I remained standing in the clearing, our hearts pounding and our bodies trembling. The ritual had taken everything from us, yet it felt as if we had reclaimed a small measure of our power. We had confronted the curse head-on and survived its fury. However, the experience had changed us irrevocably. In the days that followed, as we worked to repair the battered RV and make our way back to civilization, the forest seemed quieter. The symbols on the trees still glowed faintly in the twilight, and sometimes I would catch a glimpse of a shadow at the edge of my vision, a reminder of the dark presence that had nearly consumed us. Lydia, ever the scholar, continued to document every detail of our ordeal, determined to preserve the memory of what we had faced, and perhaps to warn future wanderers. Yet, even as we left the clearing behind, I could not shake the feeling that the curse was not entirely lifted. Elvira's presence had been both violent and tragic, a manifestation of a deeper sorrow rooted in the history of this land. While the immediate threat had subsided, I knew that some forces, once awakened, never truly rest. The San Juan Mountains had etched themselves into my soul, and the memory of that night would forever haunt the quiet moments of my life. Reflections on Survival and Isolation. In retrospect, that harrowing experience in the depths of Colorado's wilderness taught me that survival is not solely a matter of physical endurance. It is equally a test of spirit and heart. The isolation of the mountains stripped away the pretense of control, revealing the raw, unyielding power of nature and the supernatural forces that dwell within it. Lydia and I, bound together by the crucible of terror and the shared act of confronting our pasts, emerged scarred yet resolute. The old RV, with its creaks and mechanical failures, had become a symbol of our vulnerability, its frailty a constant reminder that no matter how far we ventured, the unknown was always one misstep away. And yet, in that vulnerability lay our strength, the willingness to face the dark, both around us and within us. Today, whenever I pass through the small towns on the edge of the San Juan Mountains, I hear whispers of a woman in tattered robes, a cursed witch whose wrath still echoes through the trees. I carry those memories with me, a reminder that some encounters with the supernatural leave an indelible mark on the soul. For every traveler seeking solace in the wild, there is a risk that the shadows may follow, lurking just beyond the edge of the campfire's glow, waiting for a moment of weakness. My name is Jack Mitchell, and I am forever changed by that fateful journey. I have learned that the past is never truly buried, that the land holds memories and curses that can resurface when least expected. And as I continue my path through life, I do so with a newfound respect for the mysteries of the wilderness, and the realization that sometimes survival means confronting the darkness within and around us, even when it seems to threaten everything we hold dear. In the end, the night in the San Juan Mountains was not merely an encounter with a vengeful spirit. It was a confrontation with our own inner demons. Lydia's unwavering belief in the power of ancient lore and my own hardened determination had forged a bond that neither the fury of nature nor the cruelty of fate could easily sever. Even now, as I write these words in the safety of a more familiar environment, I can still hear the faint, sorrowful whispers of that dark autumn night, a haunting melody that reminds me that sometimes the most dangerous journeys are the ones that force us to confront the ghosts of our own past. And so, with each passing day I remain vigilant, for I know that in the quiet solitude of the wilderness, the line between myth and reality is perilously thin, and that the shadows, once disturbed, are always waiting to return.